Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we descend deeper into the quiet ritual of documentation, where human stories become permanent records, where the chaos of the moment transforms into the ordered calm of official reports. Let yourself settle as we explore the methodical world of police paperwork, the steady rhythm of forms and files that capture fragments of lives and preserve them in the silence of archives. Typing pool at the Central Police Station occupied the entire third floor of the old municipal building, a vast room filled with the steady percussion of typewriter keys against paper, carbon copies sliding between sheets, and the soft mechanical bells that announce the end of each line. Detective Lieutenant Patricia Morse had worked in this room for 12 years before her promotion to field work, and she still found something deeply comforting about returning here during quiet evening hours to complete her reports. The room was arranged in precise rows, each desk equipped with an IBM Selectric typewriter, a stack of carbon paper, and the various forms that transform spoken testimonies and handwritten notes into the permanent record of police work. During the day shift, the room buzzed with activity as clerks and officers transcribed interviews, witness statements, and investigation summaries. But now, in the deep hours of night, the space held a cathedral-like quiet that made each keystroke seem both significant and meditative. Lieutenant Morse settled at her preferred desk, the one positioned near the tall windows that faced the courthouse across the street. The building's classical facade was illuminated by streetlights that cast long shadows across the typing pool, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between the urgent business of law enforcement and the timeless patience of bureaucratic documentation. She fed a fresh sheet of paper into the typewriter, along with the carbon copies that would create the multiple records required for proper filing. The report she was about to type concerned a domestic dispute that had required 3 separate visits to resolve, each one documented with the methodical care that characterized all police paperwork. The Hendricks family lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, where Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks had been married for 23 years and had raised 4 children, 3 of whom had moved away and established their own households. The problem had begun when their youngest son, Michael, had returned home after his discharge from the military, carrying with him the invisible wounds that military service sometimes left in young men's minds. The initial police report, filed by Officer Davidson after responding to a neighbor's complaint about shouting, had described a situation that seemed straightforward enough: a young man arguing with his parents about money, responsibility, and respect. But Lieutenant Morse's investigation had revealed layers of complexity that required careful documentation to capture accurately. Michael Hendricks had served 2 tours in Vietnam, experiencing combat situations that had left him struggling with nightmares, sudden anger, and a hypervigilance that made civilian life feel constantly threatening. His parents, lacking any framework for understanding what their son had experienced, had interpreted his behavior as laziness, disrespect, and ingratitude. The first report that Lieutenant Morse typed described her initial visit to the Hendricks household, conducted on a Tuesday evening when the neighbors had again called to complain about loud arguments. The form required specific details about the physical condition of the residents, the emotional state of all parties involved, and the immediate circumstances that had prompted the police call. She typed with the steady rhythm that had become second nature over years of practice, each word chosen carefully to convey not just the facts of the situation, but the human context that gave those facts meaning. The Hendricks house had been neat and well maintained, she noted, with family photographs on the mantelpiece that showed Michael in his military uniform, smiling alongside his parents and siblings. During what appeared to be a happier time, Mr. Hendricks had been defensive during their first conversation, insisting that he had served in World War II without coming home to cause trouble for his family. Mrs. Hendricks had been tearful, expressing confusion about what had happened to the respectful, hard-working boy they had raised. Michael himself had been suspicious and hostile, viewing the police presence as another attempt by authority figures to control and restrict his behavior. The initial interview had taken nearly 2 hours, with Lieutenant Morse asking detailed questions about the family's history, Michael's military service, and the specific incidents that had led to police involvement. She had documented each person's perspective on the situation, noting the fundamental disconnect between Michael's experience of trauma and his parents' expectations of normal family life. The typewriter's keys struck the carbon paper with satisfying precision, creating multiple copies of each page that would be distributed to different departments and filed in various locations throughout the police station's bureaucratic infrastructure. The original would go to the case file, one copy to the district commander's office, another to the social services liaison, and a fourth to the growing collection of reports that documented the TUVN department's handling of veteran-related issues. Lieutenant Morse's second visit to the Hendricks household had occurred a week later, after Mrs. Hendricks had called to report that Michael had disappeared for 3 days, before returning home without explanation. This incident had required a different type of documentation, focusing on the missing person procedures that had been initiated and subsequently canceled. When Michael returned on his own, the report described how Michael had been found sleeping in a homeless encampment near the river, where other veterans had created an informal community of men who shared similar struggles with readjusting to civilian life. He had spent 3 days there, talking with other former soldiers who understood his experiences in ways that his family could not. The encampment had no official status, existing in a legal gray area that complicated police response to the various issues that arose there. Lieutenant Morse had interviewed several of the veterans living in the encampment, documenting their stories with the same careful attention she gave to all police reports. These men had served in different wars and different branches of the military, but they shared common experiences of combat trauma, difficulty maintaining employment, and family relationships strained by behaviors that civilian society struggled to understand or accommodate. The documentation process for these interviews had been challenging, as many of the men had no permanent addresses, no regular employment, and complicated relationships with law enforcement. Lieutenant Morse had developed a special set of forms for these situations, creating a record-keeping system that respected the dignity of these individuals, while also maintaining the accuracy and completeness that police work required. One veteran, Frank Morrison, had served in Korea and had been living rough for nearly 15 years, moving between encampments, shelters, and brief periods of unstable housing. His story, as documented in Lieutenant Morse's carefully typed report, illustrated the long-term consequences of combat trauma in an era when such injuries were poorly understood and inadequately treated. Morrison had been wounded in action, receiving a Purple Heart and an honorable discharge. But the psychological wounds had proven more difficult to heal than the physical ones. He had struggled with nightmares, alcohol dependency, and an inability to maintain the steady employment that civilian life required. His family had tried to help, but their efforts had been undermined by their lack of understanding about the nature of his condition. The report documented Morrison's gradual isolation from mainstream society, his increasing reliance on other veterans for understanding and support, and his eventual acceptance of homelessness as preferable to the constant stress of trying to meet civilian expectations that felt impossible to fulfill. Lieutenant Morse had interviewed Morrison during several visits to the encampment, building enough trust to gather the detailed information that proper documentation required. These interviews had revealed the informal support systems that veterans had created to supplement the inadequate official services available to them. The encampment operated according to its own rules and hierarchies, with older veterans providing guidance and protection to newer arrivals, and everyone sharing resources and information about employment opportunities, medical care, and legal assistance. Lieutenant Morse's reports documented these social structures with anthropological precision, recognizing that law enforcement needed to understand these communities in order to work with them effectively. The encampment represented both a problem and a solution, providing necessary support to vulnerable individuals while also existing outside the official systems that were supposed to serve their needs. The third visit to the Hendricks household had been prompted by a more serious incident when Michael had been arrested for fighting in a downtown bar. The charges had eventually been dropped after witnesses confirmed that he had been defending another veteran from harassment by local college students. But the incident had prompted a deeper investigation into the underlying causes of his violent behavior. The arrest report, which Lieutenant Morse had typed with particular care, described the complex circumstances that had led to the altercation. Michael had been drinking at Murphy's Tavern, an establishment that served as an informal gathering place for veterans, when a group of college students had begun making comments about a homeless veteran who was panhandling outside. The comments had escalated to harassment and eventually to physical intimidation that had prompted Michael's intervention. The incident had been witnessed by several people, including the bartender, who had provided detailed statements about the sequence of events that led to the fight. Lieutenant Morse had interviewed each witness separately, documenting their accounts with the meticulous attention to detail that ensured accurate legal records. The resulting report painted a complex picture of social tensions, economic inequality, and the ongoing challenges faced by veterans trying to reintegrate into civilian society. The college students involved in the incident had been from affluent families and had no understanding of the economic and psychological pressures that led to homelessness among veterans. Their harassment of the panhandler had been casual and thoughtless, reflecting attitudes that were common among young people who had never experienced economic hardship or military service. Michael's response to this harassment had been immediate and violent, reflecting both his protective instincts toward fellow veterans and his hyper-vigilant reaction to perceived threats. The fight had been brief but intense, resulting in minor injuries to two of the college students and significant property damage to the bar's interior. Lieutenant Morse had spent considerable time documenting the broader context that made this incident comprehensible, interviewing social workers, veterans administration counselors, and community leaders who worked with veteran populations. Her reports created a comprehensive record of the social and institutional factors that contributed to these kinds of conflicts. The documentation process had also involved extensive research into the legal precedents and administrative procedures that governed police response to veteran-related incidents. Lieutenant Morse had discovered that the department lacked clear guidelines for handling cases involving combat trauma, relying instead on general procedures that were poorly suited to the specific challenges these situations presented. Her reports had included recommendations for policy changes, training programs, and community partnerships that could improve the department's effectiveness in working with veteran populations. These recommendations had been based on careful analysis of similar programs in other cities, combined with input from local veterans organizations and mental health professionals. The typing process for these comprehensive reports had taken many hours, with Lieutenant Morse working late into the night to ensure that every detail was accurately captured and properly formatted. The typewriter's steady rhythm had become a form of meditation, each keystroke contributing to the creation of a permanent record that could guide future policy decisions and training programs. The carbon paper had created multiple copies of each page, allowing the reports to be distributed to various departments and agencies that needed access to the information. The original reports had been filed in the central record system, while copies had been sent to the Veterans Administration, the District Attorney's Office, and the Social Services Department. Lieutenant Morse had also maintained personal copies of the reports, organized in her own filing system that allowed her to track patterns and trends across multiple cases. This personal archive had become a valuable resource for understanding the evolving needs of the veteran population and the effectiveness of various intervention strategies. The Hendricks case had eventually been resolved through a combination of family counseling, medical treatment for Michael's combat-related trauma, and connection to veteran support services that provided both practical assistance and peer support. The resolution had taken nearly 6 months, requiring multiple police visits, extensive documentation, and careful coordination between various agencies and organizations. The final report in the Hendricks file had been perhaps the most satisfying for Lieutenant Morse to type, documenting how the family had learned to understand and accommodate Michael's needs while also helping him develop coping strategies that made family life more harmonious. Michael had found employment through a veteran job placement program and had begun attending group therapy sessions with other combat veterans. The case had also led to broader changes in department policy, with new training programs for officers who responded to veteran-related calls and improved coordination with community organizations that provided veteran services. Lieutenant Morse's detailed documentation had provided the foundation for these policy changes, demonstrating the importance of careful record-keeping and identifying systemic issues and developing effective solutions. She had continued to follow up on the case periodically, typing brief supplemental reports that documented the family's ongoing progress and the effectiveness of the various interventions that had been implemented. These follow-up reports had become part of a larger study of veteran reintegration that the department was conducting in cooperation with the local university's social work program. The typing pool around her remained quiet as Lieutenant Morse worked, the only sounds being the mechanical percussion of typewriter keys and the soft whisper of paper being fed through the machines. The work required a particular kind of concentration, a focus on accuracy and detail that transformed the chaotic emotions of human crisis into the ordered calm of official documentation. Each report that emerged from these typewriters represented hours of investigation, multiple interviews, and careful analysis of complex social situations. The documents served multiple purposes, providing legal records for court proceedings, administrative data for policy development, and historical archives that preserved the community's collective memory of how it had addressed various challenges and crises. Lieutenant Morse had developed a personal philosophy about the importance of this documentation work, viewing each report as a small contribution to the larger project of understanding human behavior and improving social institutions. The careful attention to detail, the precise use of language, and the systematic organization of information all serve to transform individual incidents into broader knowledge that could benefit the entire community. The carbon copies that the typewriters produced ensured that this knowledge was preserved in multiple locations, creating redundancy that protected against loss while also ensuring that relevant information reached all the people and agencies that needed access to it. The distribution system had been carefully designed to balance the need for information sharing with requirements for privacy and confidentiality. As she continued typing, Lieutenant Morse thought about the evolution of police work that these reports documented. The cases from earlier decades had often been resolved through informal community mechanisms, with police serving primarily as mediators and referral agents. More recent cases reflected the increasing complexity of social problems and the growing specialization of services available to address them. The documentation requirements had also evolved, becoming more detailed and systematic, as the department had recognized the value of comprehensive record keeping for understanding trends. evaluating programs, and improving practices. The typewritten reports had replaced handwritten notes, providing greater legibility and creating permanent records that could withstand the test of time. Lieutenant Morse had witnessed this evolution firsthand, having begun her career when police reports were still handwritten in ledger books and filed in simple alphabetical systems. The introduction of typewriters had revolutionized the department's ability to create clear, comprehensive records that could be easily copied and distributed to multiple locations. The carbon paper technology had been particularly important, allowing simultaneous creation of multiple copies without the need for separate typing sessions. This efficiency had made it practical to create the comprehensive documentation that modern police work required, while also ensuring that important information was preserved in multiple locations. The forms themselves had been carefully designed to capture the specific types of information that police work generated, with sections for witness statements, evidence descriptions, investigative procedures, and outcome documentation. The standardized format ensured consistency across different cases and officers, while also providing space for the detailed narratives that captured the unique circumstances of each situation. Lieutenant Morse had participated in several committees that had worked to improve these forms, drawing on her experience with both field work and documentation to identify areas where the reports could be made more comprehensive or easier to complete. The resulting improvements had enhanced the department's ability to create accurate, useful records while also reducing the time required for officers to complete their paperwork. The filing systems that organized these reports had also evolved, becoming more sophisticated as the volume of documentation had increased. The Central Records Division had developed elaborate, cross-referencing systems that allowed reports to be located by case number, date, location, type of incident, or names of individuals involved. This organizational structure had made it possible to identify patterns and trends across multiple cases, providing valuable intelligence for crime prevention and resource allocation. Lieutenant Morse had often used these cross-references to research similar cases when working on complex investigations, drawing on the collective experience documented in hundreds of previous reports. The typewriting process itself had become a form of professional skill, with experienced officers developing techniques for rapid, accurate typing that allowed them to complete reports efficiently without sacrificing quality. Lieutenant Morse had practiced these techniques until the physical act of typing had become almost automatic, allowing her to focus her attention on the content and organization of her reports rather than the mechanics of creating them. The rhythm of typing had also become a tool for thinking, with the steady percussion of keys providing a meditative backdrop that helped her organize complex information and identify the most important points to emphasize in her reports. The physical act of typing seemed to slow down her thinking process, allowing for more careful consideration of word choice and narrative structure. Late-night typing sessions, like this one, had become her preferred time for completing complex reports, when the quieter environment allowed for deeper concentration and more thoughtful analysis. The absence of daytime distractions created space for the kind of reflective thinking that comprehensive documentation required. The reports that emerged from these sessions were often more nuanced and insightful than those completed during busy daytime hours, when the pressure to process cases quickly sometimes resulted in abbreviated documentation that missed important details or failed to capture the full complexity of human situations. Lieutenant Morse had developed a reputation within the department for the quality and comprehensiveness of her reports, which often served as models for other officers learning to document complex cases. Her reports were frequently cited in policy discussions and training programs, demonstrating how careful attention to documentation could enhance both individual cases and broader departmental practices. The carbon copies of her reports had found their way into training files, policy manuals, and research studies, extending their influence far beyond the immediate cases they documented. This broader impact had reinforced her belief in the importance of treating each report as a contribution to the collective knowledge of the profession. As she reached the conclusion of the Hendricks case documentation, Lieutenant Morse reflected on how the typing process had helped her understand the deeper patterns and implications of the case. The act of organizing her observations and experiences into formal written language had clarified her thinking and revealed connections that had not been immediately apparent during the fieldwork. The final page of the report emerged from the typewriter with the same mechanical precision as the first, each letter sharp and clear against the white paper. The carbon copies had captured every word perfectly, creating multiple records that would be distributed to their appropriate destinations throughout the department's administrative structure. Lieutenant Morse removed the papers from the typewriter and arranged them in neat stacks, checking each page for clarity and completeness before placing them in the appropriate folders for processing. The physical act of handling these documents felt significant, like completing a ritual that transformed chaotic human experience into ordered institutional memory. The typing pool around her remained quiet, waiting for the return of daytime activity, when other officers would continue the endless process of transforming police work into permanent records. The typewriters sat ready, their ribbons fresh and their keys poised to strike paper with the same mechanical precision that had characterized law enforcement documentation for decades. Outside the windows, the city continued its restless movement through the night, generating new incidents that would eventually require their own careful documentation. But for now, the Hendricks case had been captured completely in the carefully typed pages that would preserve their story in the quiet archives of official memory, where all such stories eventually came to rest in the ordered silence of completed paperwork. The sub-basement of the Central Records Building stretched beneath the city like a vast catacomb of human memory, its corridors lined with filing cabinets that reached from floor to ceiling in perfect, endless rows. Archive specialist Elena Vasquez had worked in these depths for 18 years, becoming intimately familiar with the rhythm of preservation that governed this underground world where time moved at the pace of settling dust and fading ink. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song above the maze of metal cabinets, each one containing thousands of files that documented the patient work of law enforcement across decades of changing seasons and shifting social tides. Elena moved through these corridors with the quiet reverence of a librarian in a cathedral, understanding that she was the custodian of stories that had outlived their immediate urgency but retained their essential humanity. Her cartwheels whispered against the polished concrete floor as she made her morning rounds, checking the climate control systems that maintained the precise temperature and humidity levels necessary for long-term document preservation. The files in these cabinets span nearly a century of police work, from handwritten reports on yellowed paper to typewritten documents whose carbon copies had created permanent records of temporary crises. The oldest section of the archives occupied the northeastern corner of the basement, where cabinets from the 1920s held reports written in careful script by officers whose names had long since been engraved on the department's memorial wall. These files had acquired a particular fragility over the decades, their paper becoming translucent with age, their ink fading to sepia tones that gave them the appearance of historical documents rather than working police records. Elena paused at cabinet 1247A, one of the oldest in the collection, its metal surface bearing the patina of decades and the small dents and scratches that accumulated through years of careful use. Inside, manila folders hung in perfect alignment, each one containing reports from the autumn of 1923, when the city had been smaller and its problems more manageable. though no less real to the people who lived them. She pulled the first file. Handling it with the careful touch that long experience had taught her was necessary for these fragile documents. The case involved a missing child named Dorothy Kellerman, 8 years old, who had disappeared while walking home from school on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The investigating officer, Sergeant William Hayes, had documented his search with the methodical patience that characterized police work of that era. Asterisk. The initial report was written in flowing script that required careful attention to decipher. Each word formed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that handwriting was a form of permanent communication that needed to be legible decades after its creation. Sergeant Hayes had described the search procedures in detail, noting how the entire neighborhood had mobilized to look for Dorothy, with volunteers checking every basement, attic, and outbuilding within a mile radius of her last known location. Elena could almost feel the anxiety that had gripped the community during those days of searching. Though nearly a century had passed since Dorothy's disappearance had disrupted the quiet routine of her neighborhood. The report described how Mrs. Kellerman had waited on her front porch through 3 cold nights, wrapped in a quilt and holding a kerosene lamp, hoping that Dorothy would find her way home through the darkness. The search had involved the entire police force of that smaller department, supplemented by volunteers from the fire department, local businesses, and churches throughout the city. Sergeant Hayes had coordinated these efforts with military precision, dividing the search area into grids and assigning teams to cover each section systematically. His reports documented the gradual expansion of the search radius as the initial areas yielded no trace of the missing child. On the 4th day, according to Sergeant Hayes' careful documentation, Dorothy had been found sleeping in the basement of an abandoned house 6 blocks from her school, having apparently taken shelter there after becoming lost and disoriented during a sudden autumn thunderstorm. She had survived on rainwater collected in tin cans and some apples that had fallen from trees in the yard of the abandoned property. Asterisk. The reunion had been documented with the same attention to detail that characterized all of Sergeant Hayes' work, including Dorothy's own account of her experience as related through her parents, since department policy of that era did not permit direct interviews with children. She had described becoming frightened by the storm while walking home, taking shelter in what she thought was a temporary refuge, and then becoming too scared to leave as darkness fell and she realized she was lost. Elena found herself moved by the simple human drama contained in these faded pages, imagining the relief that must have flooded through the community when Dorothy was found safe. The file contained letters from neighbors thanking Sergeant Hayes for his persistence, along with a formal commendation from the police chief praising the systematic approach that had led to Dorothy's recovery. But what struck Elena most deeply was the final document in the file, a letter written by Dorothy herself several years later, when she had learned to write well enough to express her gratitude to the police officer who had found her. The letter, written in the careful script of a young student, thanked Sergeant Hayes for not giving up on her and promised that she would always remember his kindness. This personal touch transformed the official police report into something more intimate and lasting, a reminder that behind every case file was a human story with real consequences for real people. Elena had encountered many such letters over her years in the archives, small documents that provided glimpses into the lasting impact of police work on the lives of ordinary citizens. She carefully returned Dorothy's file to its proper place and pulled another folder from the same cabinet, this one dealing with a burglary case from December 1923. The investigating officer, Detective Thomas Morrison, had approached the case with the same methodical patience that characterized all police work of that era. When time seemed more abundant and investigations could unfold at a more deliberate pace, the burglary had occurred at Peterson's General Store, where someone had broken in during the night and stolen approximately $30 from the cash register, along with several items of merchandise including tobacco, candy, and warm clothing. Detective Morrison's report described the crime scene with careful attention to detail, noting the method of entry, the condition of the store's interior, and the specific items that had been taken. What made this case particularly interesting was Detective Morrison's analysis of the theft pattern, which suggested that the burglar had been motivated more by immediate need than by profit. The clothing items were all winter garments suitable for someone living outdoors, and the food items were non-perishable goods that could sustain someone for several days. The small amount of money taken suggested someone who needed immediate resources rather than someone planning a major score. Detective Morrison had interviewed several transient workers who had been passing through the city, following leads that eventually connected the burglary to a 16-year-old boy named James Sullivan, who had been living rough since running away from an abusive home situation in a neighboring state. The investigation had taken 3 weeks, not because of any particular complexity, but because Detective Morrison had taken the time to understand the full context of the crime. Resolution of the case had been handled with unusual compassion for that era. Rather than simply prosecuting the boy for burglary, Detective Morrison had worked with local social services and the Sullivan family to address the underlying problems that had led to the crime. James had been returned to his family with the understanding that his father would receive counseling for his drinking problem and that local authorities would monitor the situation to ensure the boys' safety. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, had been initially reluctant to drop the charges, but had eventually agreed to the alternative resolution after Detective Morrison explained the circumstances that had led to the theft. The final report noted that Mr. Peterson had even offered to employ the boy during summer months, providing both income and supervision that would help prevent future problems. Elena found these old cases fascinating because they revealed different approaches to law enforcement that reflected the smaller, more interconnected communities of earlier eras. Police officers seem to have had more latitude for creative problem solving and more time for understanding the social context of crimes rather than simply processing them through the justice system. She moved to another section of the archives, pulling files from the 1940s that documented the challenges law enforcement had faced during the war years, when many experienced officers had been called to military service and their replacements had been forced to handle increased responsibilities with minimal training and supervision. One file that caught her attention dealt with a series of thefts from local farms, where someone had been stealing chickens, vegetables, and other food items during a period when rationing had made such goods particularly valuable. The investigating officer, Detective Sarah Chun, had approached the case with systematic determination despite the challenges of working with a reduced staff and limited resources. Detective Chun's reports revealed the particular pressures that war had placed on both law enforcement and the broader community. Many families were struggling with reduced incomes due to men being away in military service, while rationing had created shortages that made even basic necessities difficult to obtain through legal means. The thefts represented not just criminal activity, but symptoms of broader social stress that required careful understanding. The investigation had eventually identified the thief as Mrs. Martha Rodriguez, a widow whose husband had been killed in action in the Pacific Theater. She had been struggling to feed her 3 young children on a war widow's pension that proved inadequate for their basic needs, and had begun taking food from local farms when her children complained of constant hunger. Detective Chun's handling of the case had been exemplary, working with community organizations to provide assistance to Mrs. Rodriguez, while also ensuring that the farmers received compensation for their losses. The resolution had involved connecting the widow with federal assistance programs, organizing community support for her family, and establishing a system for ongoing monitoring to prevent future problems. The file contained letters from several community members praising Detective Chun's compassionate approach to the case, along with a formal commendation from the police chief recognizing her ability to address both the immediate crime and its underlying causes. Mrs. Rodriguez herself had written a letter expressing her gratitude and reporting that she had found employment at a local factory that was producing supplies for the war effort. These wartime cases revealed how external pressures could create conditions that led to crime, while also highlighting the importance of understanding social context in developing effective law enforcement responses. Detective Chun's reports demonstrated how good police work required not just investigative skills, but also empathy, creativity, and willingness to work with other community institutions to address complex problems. Elena continued her journey through the archives, pulling files from different eras and noting how the style and focus of police reports had evolved over the decades. The handwritten reports from the early decades gave way to typewritten documents in the 1940s and 1950s, with carbon copies ensuring that multiple records were created for each case. The language of the reports had also evolved, becoming more formal and standardized as departments developed more systematic approaches to documentation. But throughout all these changes, Elena could trace consistent themes of human complexity, community concern, and the patient work of understanding that characterized effective police work across all eras. She paused at a section containing files from the 1960s, when social changes had created new challenges for law enforcement, while also opening opportunities for innovative approaches to community policing. One file that particularly interested her dealt with a series of incidents involving teenagers who had been gathering in a local park to listen to music and socialize in ways that some community members found threatening. The investigating officer, Lieutenant Robert Kim, had approached the situation not as a law enforcement problem, but as a communication issue between different generations who had different expectations about appropriate public behavior. His reports documented extensive conversations with both the teenagers and the adult residents who had complained about their activities. The teenagers, according to Lieutenant Kim's interviews, were simply looking for a safe space to gather and listen to music that their parents found objectionable. They had chosen the park because it was public space where they felt they had a right to be, and they had been careful to avoid damaging property or creating disturbances that would justify police intervention. The adult complainants had been concerned about the large groups of young people, the volume of their music, and their general appearance, which reflected fashion trends that older residents found alarming. The complaints had escalated when some parents had attempted to disperse the gatherings themselves, leading to confrontations that had required police intervention. Lieutenant Kim had resolved the situation by organizing community meetings where both teenagers and adults could express their concerns and work together to develop guidelines that would allow the park to be shared peacefully. The process had taken several months, but had resulted in a formal agreement that established specific times and areas where young people could gather, while also ensuring that other park users could enjoy the space without disruption. The file contained documentation of the ongoing success of this agreement, with follow-up reports noting that the park had become a model for positive community relations between different age groups. Lieutenant Kim had continued to monitor the situation periodically, ensuring that the agreement remained effective as both the teenage population and community concerns evolved. Elena found these cases particularly interesting because they demonstrated how police work could serve community-building functions that went far beyond traditional law enforcement. Officers like Lieutenant Kim had understood that their role included helping different community groups find ways to coexist peacefully. even when their conflicts did not involve obvious criminal activity. The archives contained hundreds of such cases, each one representing a small but significant moment in the ongoing work of maintaining social order and community cohesion. Elena had developed a deep appreciation for the creativity and patience that characterized the best police work, recognizing that effective law enforcement often required skills that were more diplomatic than punitive. She moved to a more recent section of the archives, pulling files from the 1970s that documented the department's response to changing social conditions and evolving crime patterns. One case that caught her attention involved a series of thefts from local businesses that had initially appeared to be the work of professional criminals, but had eventually been traced to a group of teenagers who were stealing to support drug habits. The investigating detective, Maria Santos, had approached the case with the systematic patience that characterized good police work, while also recognizing that drug-related crime required different strategies than traditional theft cases. Her reports documented extensive research into the local drug market, the sources of supply that made drugs available to teenagers, and the social conditions that made drug use attractive to young people from otherwise stable families. The investigation had taken several months and had involved cooperation with federal drug enforcement agencies, local school officials, and community organizations that worked with at-risk youth. Detective Santos had documented each phase of the investigation with careful attention to both the criminal aspects of the case and the broader social issues that had created the conditions for the crimes. The resolution had involved arrests of several adult drug dealers who had been targeting teenagers, along with treatment and counseling programs for the young people who had committed the thefts. Detective Santos had worked closely with family members and school counselors to ensure that the teenagers received appropriate support for their drug problems, while also being held accountable for their criminal behavior. The file contained extensive follow-up documentation, tracking the progress of each teenager through treatment programs and their eventual return to school and family life. Detective Santos had maintained contact with the families for more than a year after the case was closed, ensuring that the intervention had been successful and that no further problems had developed. These more recent cases reflected the increasing complexity of social problems that police were being asked to address, along with the growing recognition that effective law enforcement required collaboration with many other community institutions. Detective Santos' work demonstrated how good police investigation could identify and address not just immediate crimes, but also the broader social conditions that created opportunities for criminal behavior. Elena continued her exploration of the archives, noting how each era had brought its own challenges and how dedicated officers had developed innovative approaches to address them. The files created a vast library of human experience that documented not just individual crimes, but the evolution of communities and the changing nature of social problems over time. The preservation of these records required constant attention to environmental conditions, with Elena monitoring temperature and humidity levels that needed to remain within narrow ranges to prevent deterioration of the paper and ink. The oldest files were particularly vulnerable, requiring special handling and climate control that protected them from the natural processes of decay that would eventually claim all organic materials. But the effort was worthwhile, Elena believed, because these archives represented more than just administrative records. They documented the patient work of thousands of officers who had dedicated their careers to understanding human behavior and finding ways to maintain social order while respecting individual dignity and community values. Each file told a story of human complexity, revealing the circumstances that led ordinary people to make choices that brought them into contact with law enforcement. Reading these stories, Elena had developed a deep appreciation for the challenges that police officers faced in their daily work and the wisdom that many of them had brought to situations that could have been handled with less understanding and creativity. The archives also documented the evolution of police work itself, showing how departments had developed more sophisticated approaches to investigation, community relations, and crime prevention. The careful documentation that officers had maintained over decades had created a knowledge base that allowed later generations to learn from past experience and avoid repeating mistakes. As Alina completed her rounds through the archives, checking that all files were properly positioned and that environmental conditions remained stable, she reflected on the importance of preservation work that she and her colleagues performed. These documents represented the institutional memory of law enforcement, containing lessons and insights that could guide future officers in their work. The quiet of the archives had a cathedral-like quality that Elena found deeply peaceful. A sense of being surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations of dedicated public servants. The files rested in their careful order, waiting for researchers, historians, and curious officers who might need to understand how similar problems had been addressed in the past. In the deepest corners of the archive, where the oldest files slept in their climate-controlled peace, dust motes continued their eternal dance through shafts of fluorescent light, settling gently on surfaces that held the preserved memories of a century of police work. Each speck of dust was like a moment in time, gradually accumulating until it too would need to be carefully cleaned away to protect the documents that held these stories of human complexity and official response. The archives would continue their patient work of preservation, maintaining these records for future generations who might need to understand how their community had addressed the eternal challenges of human behavior and social order. In the ordered silence of endless rows of filing cabinets, thousands of stories slept peacefully, waiting for the moment when they might once again serve the cause of justice and community understanding. Asterisk. The old courthouse on Fifth Avenue stood like a granite monument to the enduring pursuit of justice, its neoclassical columns rising 4 stories above the street where generations of citizens had climbed its steps, seeking resolution to conflicts that had disrupted the peaceful order of their lives. Building Superintendent Marcus Thompson had worked within these walls for 23 years, becoming intimately familiar with every courtroom, every holding cell, and every corridor that comprised this temple of civic order. In the deep hours before dawn, when the last night shift officers had completed their rounds and the earliest maintenance staff had not yet arrived, Marcus would walk through the empty building with a set of keys that unlocked doors to spaces where human drama had played out in carefully choreographed rituals of testimony, evidence, and judgment. The silence that filled these rooms during these hours held a different quality than ordinary quiet, weighted with the accumulated gravity of thousands of cases that had been heard within these walls. The main courtroom occupied the 2nd floor, its mahogany paneling and brass fixtures reflecting the dignity that earlier generations had believed necessary for the proper administration of justice. The judge's bench rose above the courtroom floor like an altar, its dark wood polished to a mirror shine that had reflected the faces of defendants, attorneys, witnesses, and jurors through decades of morning sessions and afternoon deliberations. Marcus paused in the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim light that filtered through the tall windows from the streetlights outside. The courtroom held space for nearly 200 people, with wooden pews arranged in precise rows that faced the bench with the orderly expectation of a congregation awaiting service. During the day, these seats would fill with family members, journalists, curious citizens, and court officials who came to witness the careful process by which society addressed violations of its collectively agreed-upon rules. But now, in the pre-dawn silence, the empty seats created a vast cathedral of potential, waiting to be filled with the next day's collection of human stories that would require the patient attention of judges, juries, and the elaborate apparatus of legal procedure that transformed personal conflicts into official resolutions. Marcus walked slowly down the center aisle, his soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished marble floor that had been worn smoothed by the passage of countless feet seeking justice or redemption. The witness box stood to the right of the judge's bench, a simple wooden structure that had heard testimony from thousands of people whose lives had intersected with crime in ways both large and small. Marcus had observed many of these testimonies over his years of maintaining the building. Noting how the formal setting seemed to transform ordinary citizens into careful speakers, who weighed each word with unusual precision, he remembered Mrs. Elizabeth Carson, an elderly woman who had testified in a burglary case involving the theft of her late husband's war medals. She had spoken in a voice barely above a whisper, describing how the medals had been displayed in a shadow box in her living room and how their disappearance had felt like losing her husband all over again. The defendant, a teenager named Michael Torres, had sat at the defense table with tears streaming down his face as Mrs. Carson explained the personal meaning of the items he had stolen. The case had been resolved with unusual compassion, Marcus recalled, with the judge accepting a plea agreement that required Michael to perform community service at the Veterans Administration Hospital, where he would learn about the sacrifices that the stolen medals represented. Mrs. Carson had attended the sentencing hearing and had spoken directly to Michael, explaining that she forgave him and hoped that he would find better ways to address whatever problems had led him to steal from her home. The courtroom had provided the formal setting that allowed this personal reconciliation to take place within the larger framework of community justice, transforming what could have been simply a matter of punishment into an opportunity for education and healing. Marcus had witnessed many such moments over his years in the building, instances where the careful procedures of the court system had created space for the kind of human understanding that made justice meaningful rather than merely mechanical. Jury box occupied the left side of the courtroom. 12 chairs arranged in 2 neat rows where citizens would sit in judgment of their neighbors' actions. Marcus had observed hundreds of juries during his time in the building, noting how the responsibility of reaching verdicts seemed to transform ordinary people into careful deliberators who took their civic duty with appropriate seriousness. He remembered one particular jury that had deliberated for 3 days in a case involving domestic violence, where the evidence had been clear but the circumstances complex enough to require careful consideration of factors that went beyond simple questions of guilt or innocence. The jury had ultimately reached a verdict that reflected their understanding of both the legal requirements and the human realities that had created the situation they were asked to judge. The defendant in that case had been Robert Hernandez, a man whose drinking problem had led to increasingly serious conflicts with his wife and children. The prosecution had presented evidence of physical violence that clearly met the legal definition of assault, but the defense had offered testimony about Robert's military service and the untreated trauma that had contributed to his alcohol dependency and violent behavior. Asterisk. The jury had found Robert guilty of the charges, but had recommended that the judge consider treatment rather than imprisonment, recognizing that simply removing him from his family would not address the underlying problems that had created the violent situation. The judge had followed their recommendation, sentencing Robert to a combination of alcohol treatment, counseling for veterans with combat trauma, and supervised probation that allowed him to remain with his family while addressing his problems. Marcus had seen Robert return to the courthouse several times over the following months for progress hearings, noting how the man's appearance gradually improved as he participated in treatment programs and learned to manage the psychological wounds that had driven his destructive behavior. The courtroom had provided not just a place for judgment, but a framework for ongoing accountability that supported Robert's efforts to rebuild his relationship with his family. These stories had accumulated over Marcus's years in the building, creating a personal archive of cases that illustrated how the formal procedures of the court system could accommodate the complex realities of human behavior when administered with wisdom and compassion. The empty courtroom held space for all these memories, its silent dignity preserving the echoes of justice carefully considered and thoughtfully applied. Marcus left the main courtroom and walked down the corridor toward the smaller hearing rooms that handled less formal proceedings. These spaces had been designed for situations that required judicial attention but did not need the full ceremony of a trial, such as plea hearings, sentencing conferences, and the various administrative proceedings that kept the court system functioning smoothly. The first hearing room he entered contained a simple conference table, surrounded by chairs where judges could meet with attorneys and defendants to discuss cases in a less formal setting than the main courtroom provided. Marcus had observed many such conferences over the years, noting how the relaxed atmosphere often allowed for more open communication between all parties involved in a case. He remembered Judge Patricia Martinez using this room for a sentencing conference involving 3 teenagers who had been caught vandalizing school property. Rather than simply imposing punishment, Judge Martinez had used the informal setting to engage in a conversation with the teenagers about their motivations and their understanding of how their actions had affected their school community. Teenagers had initially been defensive and resentful, viewing their arrest as unfair treatment by authorities who did not understand their frustrations with what they perceived as an uncaring educational system. But Judge Martinez had listened patiently to their concerns, acknowledging their feelings while also helping them understand how vandalism had created problems for custodial staff, other students, and school administrators who were trying to maintain a positive learning environment with limited resources. The conference had lasted more than 2 hours, with Judge Martinez guiding the teenagers through a process of understanding the broader consequences of their actions, while also addressing their legitimate concerns about conditions at their school. The resolution had involved not just community service to repair the damage they had caused, but also their participation in a student advisory committee that gave them constructive ways to advocate for improvements in their educational experience. Marcus had encountered all 3 teenagers at the courthouse several months later when they returned to report on their community service and their participation in the advisory committee. They had seemed like different people, engaging respectfully with courthouse staff and expressing appreciation for Judge Martinez's willingness to listen to their perspectives rather than simply punishing them for their behavior. This transformation had been made possible by the informal setting of the hearing room, which had allowed for the kind of extended conversation that would have been difficult to conduct in the formal atmosphere of the main courtroom. Marcus had observed many such proceedings over the years, noting how different physical settings could facilitate different approaches to justice that might be more appropriate for particular types of cases or particular individuals. The building also contained holding cells where defendants waited during court proceedings, spaces that had been designed to provide security while also maintaining the dignity appropriate for people who had not yet been convicted of crimes. Marcus made regular rounds through these areas, ensuring that they remained clean and properly maintained despite the temporary nature of their occupancy. The cells were arranged along a corridor in the basement level of the building, each one containing a simple bench and basic sanitary facilities. The walls had been painted in calming colors that were intended to reduce anxiety and promote the kind of quiet reflection that might help defendants prepare mentally for their court appearances. Asterisk. Marcus had observed many people during their time in these cells, noting how the experience of being temporarily confined seemed to affect different individuals in different ways. Some defendants appeared calm and resigned, using the quiet time to think about their situations and prepare for their interactions with judges and attorneys. Others seemed anxious and agitated, pacing within the small spaces and struggling with the stress of uncertainty about their futures. He remembered one particular defendant, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had been arrested for writing bad checks to cover expenses during a period of unemployment. She had spent several hours in one of the holding cells before her hearing, using the time to write a letter to her young daughter, explaining why she would not be home that evening and expressing her determination to find better ways to address their financial problems. Jennifer's case had been resolved with a combination of restitution to the businesses where she had written bad checks, community service, and connection to social services that helped her find employment and manage her finances more effectively. The holding cell had provided a space for reflection that had helped her understand the seriousness of her situation, while also allowing her to begin thinking about constructive approaches to addressing her underlying problems. The letter she had written to her daughter had become part of her case file, illustrating how even temporary confinement could create opportunities for the kind of personal reflection that supported positive change. Marcus had seen Jennifer return to the courthouse several times over the following months to report on her progress in meeting the conditions of her sentence, and he had noted how her confidence and stability had gradually improved as she re-established her financial footing. These holding cells had housed thousands of people over the years, each one facing their own personal crisis and seeking their own path toward resolution. Marcus had developed a deep appreciation for the human dignity that characterized most of these temporary residents, recognizing that criminal behavior often emerged from circumstances that could affect anyone facing sufficient stress or hardship. The building also contained offices where probation officers met with defendants to develop supervision plans that would support their successful completion of court-ordered requirements. These spaces had been designed to feel more like counseling offices than law enforcement facilities, with comfortable seating and private settings that encouraged open communication between officers and the people they supervised. Marcus had observed many such meetings over the years, noting how skilled probation officers could establish relationships with defendants that provided both accountability and support during the difficult process of addressing the problems that had led to their criminal behavior. These relationships often extended far beyond the formal requirements of court orders, becoming ongoing sources of guidance and encouragement that helped people rebuild their lives. He remembered probation officer Susan Chun working with a defendant named David Kim, who had been convicted of driving under the influence after a drinking problem had begun affecting his work, performance, and family relationships. Officer Chun had developed a supervision plan that included not just the standard requirements of alcohol treatment and community service, but also regular check-ins that addressed David's broader life circumstances and provided support for his efforts to maintain sobriety. The meetings had taken place in one of the smaller offices, where Officer Chun had created an atmosphere that felt more supportive than punitive. David had initially been resistant to supervision, viewing it as an intrusion on his privacy and an unnecessary reminder of his conviction. But Officer Chun had patiently worked to establish trust, demonstrating genuine concern for David's well-being, rather than simply monitoring his compliance with court orders. Over time, David had begun to view his meetings with Officer Chun as valuable opportunities to discuss the challenges he faced in maintaining sobriety and rebuilding relationships with family members who had been affected by his drinking. The office had become a safe space where he could acknowledge his struggles without fear of immediate consequences, while also receiving practical guidance about resources and strategies that could support his recovery. The relationship had continued even after David's formal probation had ended, with Officer Chun encouraging him to maintain contact and offering ongoing support as he continued his recovery process. Marcus had encountered David at the courthouse several times over the following years when he returned to visit Officer Chun or to speak with other defendants about his experience with the supervision process. These ongoing relationships illustrated how the courthouse building served, not just as a place for formal legal proceedings, but as a community resource that connected people with services and support that could help them address the underlying causes of their involvement with the criminal justice system. The offices and meeting rooms had provided settings where these connections could develop naturally within the framework of official accountability. Marcus continued his walk through the building, visiting the law library where attorneys researched cases and prepared arguments, the clerk's offices where court documents were filed and maintained, and the various administrative spaces that supported the complex operations of the court system. Each area had its own atmosphere and function, but all contributed to the larger purpose of providing fair and thoughtful resolution to conflicts that arose within the community. The law library occupied a quiet corner of the third floor, its shelves lined with volumes of legal precedents, statutes, and commentary that provided the intellectual foundation for judicial decision-making. Marcus had often observed attorneys working late into the evening in this space, researching obscure points of law or reviewing similar cases that might guide their arguments in upcoming proceedings. The library had a monastic quality during these quiet hours, with its tall windows and heavy wooden tables, creating an atmosphere conducive to the kind of careful study that effective legal representation required. Marcus had developed great respect for the attorneys who used this space, recognizing that their thorough preparation often made the difference between effective and inadequate representation for defendants who depended on their skills. He remembered watching attorney Sarah Rodriguez spend an entire weekend in the library preparing for a complex fraud case involving an elderly defendant who had been accused of embezzling funds from a charity where she had volunteered for many years. The evidence seemed straightforward, but attorney Rodriguez had suspected that there were underlying circumstances that might explain the defendant's behavior without excusing it. Her research had uncovered information about the early stages of dementia that could affect judgment and decision-making in ways that were not immediately apparent to family members or colleagues. This research had led to medical evaluations that confirmed the defendant's cognitive impairment and resulted in a resolution that provided treatment and supervision rather than imprisonment for someone whose criminal behavior had been caused by a medical condition. The library had provided the resources that made this thorough investigation possible, demonstrating how access to legal research could ensure that defendants received the kind of representation that addressed all aspects of their situations rather than simply responding to surface evidence. Marcus had observed many such cases over the years, noting how dedicated attorneys use the library's resources to develop creative approaches to complex legal problems. The clerk's offices maintained the vast paperwork that documented every aspect of court proceedings, from initial filings through final dispositions. These spaces buzzed with activity during business hours as staff processed the continuous flow of documents that kept the court system functioning. But during the quiet hours of early morning, they held a different kind of energy, the satisfied calm of work completed and properly filed. Marcus had great appreciation for the clerical staff who maintained these records, recognizing that their careful attention to detail ensured that court proceedings were properly documented and that defendants received the due process protections that the legal system promised. The files they maintained contained the official record of every case that passed through the courthouse, creating an archive of community justice that paralleled the police records kept in other buildings. These administrative spaces reminded Marcus that the courthouse was not just a place where dramatic legal proceedings took place, but a complex institution that required the coordinated efforts of many different professionals to function effectively. Judges, attorneys, probation officers, clerks, security personnel. and maintenance staff all contributed to the larger purpose of providing fair and effective resolution to the conflicts that inevitably arose in any community. As Marcus completed his early morning rounds through the building, checking that all systems were functioning properly and that security had been maintained throughout the night, he reflected on the important role that physical spaces played in the administration of justice. The courthouse had been designed to embody certain values about dignity, fairness, and the importance of careful deliberation in addressing human conflicts. The empty courtrooms and corridors held these values in their silence, waiting for the return of daily activity that would once again fill them with the voices of people seeking resolution to problems that had disrupted their lives. The building itself seemed to participate in this process, providing settings that encouraged respect, thoughtfulness, and the kind of careful attention that effective justice required. In the hours before dawn, when the courthouse stood empty and quiet, it seemed to gather itself for another day of serving the community's need for fair and thoughtful resolution of conflicts. The holding cells waited to provide temporary shelter for people facing uncertain futures. The courtrooms prepared to host the careful rituals of evidence and argument, and the offices stood ready to support the ongoing work of helping people rebuild their lives after their encounters with the justice system. The building held all these possibilities in its patient silence, a monument to the community's commitment to addressing human conflicts with wisdom, compassion, and respect for the dignity of all people involved. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that justice could be both firm and merciful when administered by people who understood their responsibility to serve the broader interests of community peace and individual redemption. Community Relations Officer Janet Walsh had spent 15 years walking the tree-lined streets of the Riverside District, becoming as familiar with its rhythm of daily life as residents were with the sound of her patrol car's gentle engine humming through their neighborhoods in the early morning hours. Her beat encompassed 12 square blocks of modest single-family homes where 3 generations often lived within walking distance of each other, creating the kind of extended family networks that gave communities their resilience and character. The houses sat on lots that had been platted in the 1940s, when the city had been smaller and developers had allowed more space between buildings, creating neighborhoods where children could play safely in front yards and neighbors could maintain the kind of casual surveillance that prevented most crimes before they started. Mature oak and maple trees lined the sidewalks, their branches creating a natural canopy that filtered the streetlight and gave the entire area a sense of sheltered intimacy. Officer Walsh parked her patrol car at the corner of Elm and 3rd, beginning her weekly walking patrol that allowed her to maintain the personal connections with residents that made community policing effective. The early evening hour meant that people were finishing dinner, walking dogs, and engaging in the small social interactions that created the fabric of neighborhood life. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks while parents worked in gardens or sat on porches, creating the kind of natural activity that made streets safe through simple presence and attention. She walked slowly down Elm Street, noting the small details that told her about the health of the community she served. Mrs. Patterson's garden showed signs of recent weeding and watering, indicating that the elderly woman was maintaining her independence despite her family's concerns about her living alone. The Martinez house displayed a new coat of paint on its front steps, suggesting that the family was continuing to invest in their property despite the economic pressures that had affected many households in the neighborhood. The evening walk was part of Officer Walsh's approach to community policing that emphasized relationship building over enforcement activity. She had learned that most crime prevention happened through the informal social controls that healthy neighborhoods maintained naturally, with her role being to support and strengthen these existing mechanisms rather than to replace them with formal law enforcement presence. At the corner of Elm and 4th, she encountered Mrs. Dorothy Chun walking her small terrier, a nightly ritual that had continued for the 8 years since Mrs. Chun's husband had passed away. The dog walk served multiple purposes, providing exercise for both woman and pet while also creating opportunities for social contact with neighbors who had become her extended family since her children had moved to other cities for work. Officer Walsh had first met Mrs. Chun during a burglary investigation 3 years earlier, when someone had broken into her house while she was visiting her sister in the hospital. The incident had shaken Mrs. Chun's confidence in her safety, but Officer Walsh had worked with her to develop security measures that would protect her home while also connecting her with neighbors who could provide informal supervision and support. The burglary case had been resolved when the perpetrator, a teenager named Kevin Morrison who lived 6 blocks away, had been caught attempting another break-in. But Officer Walsh had recognized that simply arresting Kevin would not address the underlying problems that had led to his criminal behavior or the vulnerability that had made Mrs. Chun a target. Kevin's family situation had been complicated by his father's unemployment and his mother's struggle with depression following a series of medical problems that had depleted the family's savings. Kevin had begun stealing small items that he could sell to contribute to household expenses, telling himself that he was helping his family even though his parents had no knowledge of his criminal activity. Officer Walsh had worked with both families to develop a resolution that addressed everyone's needs while also strengthening the informal networks that kept the neighborhood safe. Kevin had been required to make restitution for the items he had stolen from Mrs. Chun's house, but the payment plan had been structured to allow him to work off the debt through yard work and household maintenance that Mrs. Chun needed but had been unable to afford. Arrangement had evolved into an ongoing relationship that benefited both parties. Mrs. Chun had gained the security of having a reliable young person available to help with tasks that had become difficult for her to manage alone, while Kevin had found a source of legitimate income along with the guidance of an adult who took interest in his education and future plans. Officer Walsh had monitored this arrangement for several months, ensuring that it remained beneficial for both parties, while also serving as a model for other situations where crime had emerged from economic stress rather than malicious intent. The success of the relationship had demonstrated how creative problem-solving could transform the aftermath of crime into opportunities for community building. Continuing her walk down 4th Street, Officer Walsh observed the subtle signs of neighborhood social organization that most residents took for granted, but that represented the foundation of community safety. The Thompson family's front porch light illuminated not just their own walkway but also a portion of the sidewalk that other residents used during evening walks. Mr. Johnson's habit of working in his front yard during the evening hours created natural surveillance of the street that discouraged potential troublemakers. These informal security measures had evolved naturally from the social connections that residents had developed over years of living in close proximity to each other. Officer Walsh had learned to recognize and support these organic systems rather than trying to replace them with formal security measures that might actually weaken the community bonds that made them effective. She paused at the Rodriguez house, where the family had recently celebrated their daughter Maria's graduation from high school. Maria had been involved in a shoplifting incident 2 years earlier, when she and several friends had been caught taking cosmetics from a downtown department store. Officer Walsh had responded to the call and had recognized an opportunity to address the incident in ways that would strengthen, rather than damage, Maria's relationship with her family and community. Shoplifting had occurred during a period when Maria had been struggling with the social pressures of adolescence and had been seeking acceptance. from a peer group that engaged in risky behaviors. Her parents had been devastated by her arrest, fearing that their daughter was developing serious behavioral problems that they were unable to address effectively. Officer Walsh had worked with the family to develop a response that addressed both the legal consequences of Maria's actions and the underlying social dynamics that had contributed to her poor judgment. Rather than simply processing Maria through the juvenile justice system, Officer Walsh had connected the family with counseling resources and community service opportunities that would help Maria understand the impact of her behavior while also developing more positive peer relationships. Maria had been required to perform community service at a local food bank, where she had worked alongside adult volunteers who provided positive role models and helped her understand how her time and energy could contribute to community welfare rather than causing problems. The experience had been transformative, giving Maria a sense of purpose and accomplishment that had been missing from her previous social experiences. The community service had also connected Maria with other young people who were involved in positive activities, providing her with alternative peer relationships that supported better decision-making. Officer Walsh had maintained contact with the family throughout Maria's community service period, ensuring that the intervention was successful and that Maria was developing the skills and relationships that would prevent future problems. The successful resolution of Maria's case had strengthened her family's trust in law enforcement while also demonstrating to other neighborhood families that police officers could serve resources for addressing family problems rather than simply as agents of punishment. Officer Walsh had found that these positive interactions created a foundation of community trust that made her job more effective and more satisfying. Walking down 5th Street, Officer Walsh noted the signs of economic stress that affected some households in the neighborhood, recognizing that financial pressure could create conditions that led to criminal behavior, if not addressed through appropriate community support. The Henderson house showed signs of deferred maintenance that suggested the family was struggling with expenses, while the Wilson family's car had been parked in the same spot for several weeks, indicating possible mechanical problems that they could not afford to repair. These economic indicators were important for community policing because they helped identify families who might benefit from connection to social services or community assistance programs before financial stress led to more serious problems. Officer Walsh had developed relationships with social workers, community organizations, and religious institutions that could provide support to families facing temporary hardships. She remembered the Johnson family's crisis the previous winter, when Mr. Johnson had been injured in an industrial accident that left him unable to work for several months. The family had struggled to meet their mortgage payments and had begun receiving notices from their bank about possible foreclosure proceedings. Mrs. Johnson had been working 2 part-time jobs, but was still unable to generate sufficient income to maintain their household expenses. The situation had come to Officer Walsh's attention when neighbors had reported seeing strangers around the Johnson house during the day, apparently conducting appraisals or inspections related to the foreclosure process. The neighbors had been concerned about the family's welfare and had asked Officer Walsh to check on their situation. Rather than treating this as a simple welfare check, Officer Walsh had recognized an opportunity to connect the Johnson family with resources that could help them address their financial crisis before it led to more serious problems. She had worked with a community social worker to identify assistance programs that could provide temporary financial support while Mr. Johnson recovered from his injury. The intervention had involved multiple community organizations, including a local church that provided emergency financial assistance, a credit counseling service that helped the family negotiate with their creditors, and a job training program that helped Mrs. Johnson developed skills that qualified her for higher-paying employment. Officer Walsh had coordinated these services while also maintaining communication with the family to ensure that they received the support they needed. The Johnson family had eventually avoided foreclosure and had established more stable financial footing that protected them from future crises. Mr. Johnson had returned to work with modifications that accommodated his injury, while Mrs. Johnson had found steady employment that provided health insurance and other benefits that improved the family's overall security. The successful resolution of the Johnson family's crisis had demonstrated how proactive community policing could prevent problems before they escalated into criminal behavior. Officer Walsh had learned that families facing financial stress were more likely to become involved in theft, fraud, or other economic crimes if they did not receive appropriate support during their periods of crisis. Continuing her patrol along 6th Street, Officer Walsh observed the intergenerational connections that gave the neighborhood much of its stability and character. The Morrison house served as an informal gathering place for an extended family that included grandparents, parents, and grandchildren who lived within a few blocks of each other. These family networks provided natural support systems that helped individual households weather temporary crises while also creating informal supervision that discouraged criminal activity. She had worked with the Morrison family on several occasions, most recently when their teenage grandson David had been caught spray painting graffiti on the side of a local business. Rather than treating this as a simple vandalism case, Officer Walsh had recognized an opportunity to engage the entire family in addressing David's behavior while also strengthening the community connections that could prevent future problems. David's graffiti had been artistic rather than destructive, showing considerable talent that had been misdirected toward illegal expression. Officer Walsh had worked with the family and the business owner to develop a resolution that would allow David to use his artistic abilities in constructive ways while also making amends for the property damage he had caused. The resolution had involved David creating a mural on a community center wall, working under the supervision of a local artist who taught him about legal opportunities for public art. The project had taken several months to complete and had involved other young people in the neighborhood who were interested in artistic expression. The mural had become a source of neighborhood pride, demonstrating how creative problem-solving could transform potential criminal behavior into community assets. David had continued to work with the supervising artist after completing his community service, developing skills that had led to part-time employment and potential career opportunities in graphic design. The Morrison family had been actively involved in supporting David's artistic development, with his grandmother providing workspace in her garage and his uncle helping him research art schools and scholarship opportunities. This family involvement had been crucial to the success of the intervention, demonstrating how extended family networks could provide resources and support that made positive behavior change possible. Officer Walsh had continued to monitor David's progress, noting how his involvement in legitimate artistic activities had changed his peer relationships and his overall attitude toward authority figures. The experience had taught her about the importance of understanding the social context that shaped young people's behavior and the value of engaging entire families in addressing individual problems. As she walked down 7th Street, Officer Walsh reflected on how her approach to community policing had evolved over her years of working in the Riverside District. She had learned that effective crime prevention required understanding the complex web of relationships, economic pressures, and social dynamics that shaped neighborhood life, rather than simply responding to individual incidents after they occurred. The evening patrol allowed her to maintain awareness of these broader patterns, while also preserving the personal relationships with residents that made her work effective. People who knew her as a community resource rather than simply a law enforcement officer were more likely to seek her help with problems before they escalated into criminal behavior. She had also learned that many of the problems that brought her into contact with families were symptoms of larger social issues that required coordinated community response rather than individual law enforcement action. Economic stress, family dysfunction, educational problems, and mental health issues all contributed to conditions that could lead to criminal behavior, if not addressed through appropriate support services. The success stories she had witnessed in the Fay Riverside district had demonstrated how communities could develop their own capacity to address these underlying issues when law enforcement officers served as connectors and facilitators rather than simply as agents of punishment. Her role had become less about making arrests and more about helping people access the resources and support they needed to resolve their problems constructively. Walking along 8th Street, Officer Walsh encountered Mr. Robert Kim tending to his vegetable garden in the fading evening light. Mr. Kim had become an informal neighborhood leader through his work, organizing community events and his willingness to mediate disputes between neighbors before they required official intervention. Officer Walsh had first worked with Mr. Kim during a noise complaint involving a young couple who had moved into the neighborhood and had been hosting parties that disturbed their elderly neighbors. Rather than simply enforcing noise ordinances, Mr. Kim had organized a neighborhood meeting that allowed all parties to discuss their concerns and develop mutually acceptable guidelines for social gatherings. The meeting had revealed that the noise complaints were symptoms of broader generational and cultural differences between neighbors who had different expectations about appropriate community behavior. The young couple had been unaware that their activities were causing problems, while the elderly neighbors had been reluctant to approach them directly with their concerns. Mr. Kim had facilitated a conversation that helped both parties understand each other's perspectives and develop compromise solutions that allowed the young couple to maintain their social activities while also respecting their neighbors' need for quiet. The resolution had strengthened neighborhood relationships rather than creating ongoing conflict between different households. Officer Walsh had observed many such informal mediation efforts over her years in the district, noting how respected community members like Mr. Kim could often resolve conflicts more effectively than formal law enforcement intervention. Her role in these situations was to support and encourage these natural community processes rather than to replace them with official procedures. Success of informal conflict resolution depended on the existence of social networks that connected neighbors and created expectations of mutual responsibility for community welfare. Officer Walsh had learned to recognize and nurture these networks, understanding that they represented the foundation of effective crime prevention. She had also learned that her presence as a law enforcement officer could either strengthen or weaken these informal systems, depending on how she chose to interact with community conflicts. When she approached problems as opportunities for community building rather than simply as law enforcement issues, her interventions were more likely to create lasting positive change. As Officer Walsh completed her evening patrol and returned to her patrol car, she reflected on the complex interconnections between individual families and the larger community that surrounded them. Each household she had visited represented a node in a network of relationships that extended throughout the neighborhood and beyond, creating the social fabric that made community life possible. Crime, when it occurred in this context, affected not just individual victims, but entire networks of family and community relationships. Effective response required understanding these broader impacts and working to repair and strengthen the social connections that crime had damaged. The Riverside District had taught Officer Walsh that successful crime prevention was ultimately about community development rather than law enforcement. When neighborhoods maintained strong social networks, effective informal controls, and access to appropriate support services, crime rates remained low and conflicts were resolved before they escalated into serious problems. Her work had become less about responding to individual incidents and more about supporting the conditions that allowed communities to maintain their own safety and resolve their own conflicts. The evening patrols provided opportunities to assess the health of these community systems and to identify areas where additional support or intervention might be needed. As she drove slowly through the quiet streets, Officer Walsh noted the porch lights that created pools of safety along the sidewalks, the signs of family activity that indicated healthy household functioning, and the subtle indicators of community social organization that suggested the neighborhood's continued resilience. The families sleeping behind these lighted windows represented the foundation of community safety, their daily interactions and mutual support, creating the conditions that made formal law enforcement largely unnecessary. Officer Walsh's job was to protect and nurture this foundation, understanding that healthy communities were the most effective crime prevention strategy ever developed. In the gentle darkness of the neighborhood evening, the invisible bonds of community stretched between houses and families, creating a web of mutual care and responsibility that had evolved naturally from years of shared life in common space. Each porch light was indeed a small beacon, guarding not just individual households, but the collective dreams of a community that had learned to care for itself. Sergeant David Rodriguez had worked the midnight shift at the Central Precinct for 11 years, becoming intimately familiar with the unique rhythm of police work during the hours when most citizens slept safely in their beds. The station took on a different character after the evening shift departed, settling into a quieter pace that allowed for the kind of thoughtful attention to detail that was sometimes difficult to maintain during the busier daylight hours. The main desk area, which buzzed with activity during peak hours, became a peaceful command center where a skeleton crew of officers maintained watch over radio communications, processed the paperwork from the previous shift's activities, and prepared for the occasional calls that required police response during the deep hours of night. The overhead lights had been dimmed to reduce glare, creating an atmosphere that felt more contemplative than operational. Sergeant Rodriguez settled at his desk with a cup of coffee that would last him through the first several hours of his shift, opening the stack of reports that needed review and approval before they could be filed in the permanent record system. Each report represented hours of investigation, multiple interviews, and careful documentation of complex human situations that had required police intervention. His job was to ensure that these documents accurately captured the essential facts, while also reflecting the thoughtful approach that characterized the best police work. The first report he reviewed concerned a domestic disturbance that had been resolved through mediation rather than arrest, a situation that had required Officer Patricia Chun to spend 3 hours helping a family work through a crisis that had brought them to the edge of violence. The husband had been drinking heavily since losing his job at the local factory, while his wife had been working double shifts to maintain their household income while also caring for their elderly mother who lived with them. The immediate crisis had been triggered when the husband had become angry about what he perceived as his wife's criticism of his inability to find new employment. The argument had escalated to the point where neighbors had called police, concerned about shouting and the sound of furniture being moved forcefully. Officer Chun had arrived to find both spouses angry and frustrated, but willing to engage in conversation about their underlying problems, rather than simply separating the parties or making arrests based on the disturbance. Officer Chun had recognized that the situation required deeper intervention to address the economic and family pressures that were creating ongoing instability. She had spent time talking with each spouse separately, allowing them to express their frustrations and concerns without the immediate pressure of confrontation the husband had described. His sense of failure and humiliation at being unable to provide for his family, along with his growing dependence on alcohol as a way of managing his anxiety about their financial situation. The wife had expressed her exhaustion from working long hours while also providing care for her mother, along with her fear that her husband's drinking was becoming a serious problem that could threaten their marriage and their ability to maintain their household. Officer Chun's report documented how she had worked with both spouses to develop immediate strategies for managing their stress while also connecting them with longer-term resources that could address their underlying problems. The husband had agreed to contact the state employment office about job training programs, while also committing to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings to address his drinking problem. The wife had agreed to speak with social services about respite care options for her mother, allowing her to reduce her working hours and spend more time with her husband as they worked through their difficulties. Both spouses had also committed to attending counseling sessions together, with Officer Chun helping them locate a family counselor who offered services on a sliding fee scale that made treatment affordable within their reduced income. Sergeant Rodriguez noted how Officer Chun's patient approach had transformed what could have been a simple law enforcement matter into an opportunity for genuine problem solving that addressed the underlying causes of the family's crisis. The report demonstrated the kind of community policing that required officers to understand social services, family dynamics, and the economic pressures that could create conditions leading to domestic violence. The resolution documented in Officer Chun's report had required follow-up contacts over several weeks to ensure that the family was successfully accessing the resources they needed, and that their situation was stabilizing rather than deteriorating. Officer Chun had maintained communication with both the employment counselor and the family therapist, coordinating services to provide comprehensive support for the family's recovery. The final section of the report noted that the husband had found part-time employment through the job training program and had maintained sobriety for 6 weeks through his participation in Alcoholics Anonymous. The wife had been able to reduce her working hours and had reported that the counseling sessions were helping them communicate more effectively about their financial stress and family responsibilities. This case exemplified the kind of work that often went unrecognized in public discussions of police effectiveness, but that represented the foundation of community safety and family stability. Sergeant Rodriguez had seen hundreds of such cases over his years of night shift supervision, each one requiring patience, creativity, and willingness to work beyond traditional law enforcement boundaries to address complex social problems. The second report he reviewed concerned a shoplifting case that had been resolved through a creative approach that addressed both the immediate crime and the underlying circumstances that had led to the theft. Officer Michael Santos had responded to a call from Peterson's grocery store, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Martinez had been caught attempting to steal food items including bread, milk, and canned soup. The store manager had initially insisted on prosecution, viewing the theft as a straightforward criminal matter that required firm response to deter similar incidents. But Officer Santos had taken time to understand Mrs. Martinez's situation, discovering that she was living on a fixed income that had become inadequate as food prices increased and her medical expenses consumed an increasing portion of her budget. Mrs. Martinez had been too proud to ask for help from family members or social services, choosing instead to reduce her food purchases to dangerously low levels that were affecting her health and well-being. The shoplifting had been an act of desperation rather than malicious intent, representing her attempt to obtain basic nutrition when her limited resources were exhausted. Officer Santos had worked with both Mrs. Martinez and the store manager to develop a resolution that addressed everyone's needs while also preventing future incidents. The store manager had agreed to accept restitution for the stolen items while also participating in a community program that provided emergency food assistance to elderly customers who were struggling with food insecurity. Mrs. Martinez had been connected with social services that helped her apply for food stamps and other assistance programs that she had been eligible for but had not known how to access. Officer Santos had also arranged for her to receive regular visits from a community volunteer who could help her with grocery shopping and meal planning within her limited budget. The resolution had included Mrs. Martinez performing volunteer work at the community food bank, allowing her to contribute to the same type of program that was helping her, while also providing social contact that reduced the isolation that had contributed to her reluctance to seek help. The volunteer work had given her a sense of purpose and community connection that had improved her overall quality of life. Sergeant Rodriguez appreciated how Officer Santos had recognized that prosecuting an elderly woman for stealing food would not address the underlying problem of food insecurity among seniors living on fixed incomes. The creative resolution had transformed a potential criminal case into an opportunity for community education and support system development. The store manager had become an advocate for the emergency food assistance program, encouraging other local businesses to participate and helping to identify other customers who might benefit from similar support. The program had grown to serve dozens of elderly residents who were struggling with food insecurity, preventing other potential incidents, while also strengthening community support networks. Third report dealt with a vandalism case that had been resolved through community engagement and restorative justice principles. Officer Jennifer Kim had investigated graffiti that had appeared on several buildings in the downtown business district, working systematically to identify the artist and understand the motivations behind the unauthorized artwork. The graffiti had been more artistic than destructive, featuring abstract designs and social commentary that demonstrated considerable skill and creativity. Rather than simply viewing this as property damage that required punishment, Officer Kim had approached the case as an opportunity to understand why someone was choosing a legal expression over available legal alternatives. Her investigation had eventually identified the artist as Marcus Thompson, a 17-year-old high school student who had been frustrated by the lack of opportunities for young people to display their artwork in the community. Marcus had explained that he had tried to participate in official art programs, but had found them restrictive and uninteresting compared to the freedom that street art provided. Officer Kim had worked with Marcus, local business owners, and community arts organizations to develop a resolution that would allow him to continue his artistic development while also making amends for the property damage he had caused. The solution had involved Marcus creating a large mural on the side of the community center, working under the supervision of established artists who could help him develop his skills. The mural project had expanded to include other young artists who were interested in legal opportunities for public art expression. The community center had provided wall space and art supplies, while local artists had volunteered their time to provide instruction and guidance. For the young participants, the project had taken 3 months to complete and had resulted in a vibrant mural that depicted the history and diversity of the local community. The artwork had become a source of neighborhood pride and had inspired other communities to develop similar programs that channeled young people's creative energy into positive community projects. Marcus had continued his involvement with the community arts program after completing his restorative justice requirements, eventually receiving a scholarship to attend art school based partly on his work with the mural project. Officer Kim had maintained contact with him throughout his high school years, serving as a reference for college applications. and continuing to support his artistic development. The case had demonstrated how law enforcement could serve community development goals while also addressing criminal behavior in ways that strengthened, rather than damaged, relationships between young people and authority figures. The mural project had created ongoing opportunities for positive youth engagement that prevented other potential incidents while also enhancing the physical appearance of the community. Sergeant Rodriguez completed his review of the 3 reports and moved them to the approval stack that would be processed by the administrative staff during the day shift. Each case represented hours of thoughtful police work that went far beyond simple law enforcement to address the underlying social conditions that could lead to criminal behavior. The night shift provided an ideal environment for this kind of detailed paperwork review, when the quieter pace allowed for careful consideration of the approaches that officers had taken to complex cases. Sergeant Rodriguez had learned that the quality of police work could often be measured not by the number of arrests made but by the creativity and effectiveness of problem-solving approaches that prevented future incidents. He turned his attention to the radio communications that connected the night shift with patrol officers who were maintaining watch over the sleeping city. The radio traffic was lighter during these hours, consisting mainly of routine check-ins, occasional traffic stops, and the rare emergency calls that required immediate response. Officer Lisa Wong radioed in from her patrol sector, reporting that she had completed a welfare check on an elderly resident whose family had been concerned about his failure to answer telephone calls. The man had been found safe but had been suffering from a minor illness that had left him too weak to get out of bed to answer his phone. Officer Wong had helped him contact his physician and had arranged for a family member to stay with him until he recovered. These welfare checks represented an important but often overlooked aspect of police work, providing safety nets for vulnerable community members who might otherwise face serious consequences from temporary health problems or family emergencies. Officer Wong's report would be brief, but her intervention had potentially prevented a medical emergency from becoming a tragedy. Officer Robert Chun radioed in from the downtown business district, where he was conducting routine security checks of commercial buildings. The overnight security patrols were designed to deter burglary and vandalism while also providing early detection of problems like broken windows, malfunctioning alarm systems, or signs of attempted break-ins. During his patrol, Officer Chun had discovered that a restaurant's back door had been left unlocked by closing staff, creating a security vulnerability that could have led to theft or vandalism. He had secured the building and contacted the owner, who had arranged to meet him at the restaurant to check the interior and reset the security system. This type of proactive patrol work helped maintain the security of the business district during vulnerable overnight hours while also building positive relationships between police and local business owners. The restaurant owner had expressed appreciation for Officer Chun's attention to detail and had committed to reviewing closing procedures with staff to prevent similar incidents. Officer Maria Santos radioed in from the residential patrol sector, where she had been monitoring a neighborhood that had experienced several car break-ins during previous weeks. Her patrol had been uneventful, but she had noted several vehicles that had been left unlocked with valuable items visible inside, creating opportunities for potential theft. Rather than simply continuing her patrol, Officer Santos had taken time to leave informational cards under the windshield wipers of these vehicles, alerting the owners to the security risks and providing tips for preventing car break-ins. This proactive approach to crime prevention could prevent future incidents while also demonstrating police concern for community safety. The informational cards were part of a broader community education program that the department had developed to address common security vulnerabilities that residents might not be aware of. The program had been effective in reducing certain types of property crime while also creating positive interactions between police and community members. Sergeant Rodriguez monitored these radio communications while also maintaining awareness of the broader patterns of police activity throughout the city. The night shift often provided opportunities to identify trends and potential problems before they became serious enough to require major interventions. He had learned that effective night shift supervision required attention to both immediate operational needs and longer-term strategic considerations. The quieter pace of overnight hours allowed for the kind of reflective analysis that could guide decisions about resource allocation, training priorities, and policy development. The station's main clock showed that it was approaching 2 a.m., the deepest part of the night shift when call volume typically reached its lowest point and officers could focus on proactive patrol activities and administrative tasks. This was often the most peaceful time in the station, when the overnight crew could work steadily through their responsibilities without the frequent interruptions that characterized busier periods. Officer David Kim called in to report that he had assisted a stranded motorist whose car had broken down on a quiet residential street. The driver had been a nurse returning home from a late shift at the hospital, and Officer Kim had waited with her until a tow truck arrived to take her car to a repair shop. He had also given her a ride home, ensuring that she reached her apartment safely. These types of service calls rarely appeared in crime statistics, but they represented an important aspect of police work that built community trust and demonstrated the broader public safety mission that extended beyond criminal law enforcement. Officer Kim's assistance had prevented a vulnerable situation from becoming dangerous while also creating a positive interaction between police and a community member. The nurse had worked at the hospital's emergency department and had expressed appreciation for understanding the challenges that public safety workers face during overnight hours. The interaction had reinforced the connections between different agencies that shared responsibility for community welfare and safety. Sergeant Rodriguez reviewed the overnight arrest log, noting that the night shift had processed only 2 arrests, both involving individuals who had been picked up on outstanding warrants during routine traffic stops. Neither arrest had involved new criminal activity, and both individuals had been processed quickly and efficiently. Through the booking system, the low arrest numbers were typical for the night shift and reflected both the reduced criminal activity during overnight hours and the department's emphasis on problem-solving approaches that addressed issues without necessarily resulting in arrests. Sergeant Rodriguez had learned the absence of arrests often indicated effective police work rather than lack of activity. The overnight hours also provided opportunities for officers to engage in community policing activities that were difficult to accomplish during busier periods. Officer Jennifer Martinez had spent time talking with late-night workers at a 24-hour diner, maintaining relationships with community members who were active during unusual hours and who could provide valuable information about neighborhood conditions. These informal contacts were essential for effective patrol work, creating networks of community cooperation that enhanced police effectiveness while also ensuring that law enforcement remained connected to the people and places they served. Officer Martinez had developed expertise in overnight community policing that made her particularly valuable during the night shift. Officer Thomas Rodriguez reported that he had conducted a security check at the high school, where custodial staff were working to prepare the building for the next day's classes. The overnight maintenance work was essential for keeping the school functioning properly, but it also created security vulnerabilities that required police attention. The security check had revealed no problems. But Officer Rodriguez had taken time to talk with the custodial staff about security procedures and had reviewed the building's alarm system with the head custodian. These routine interactions helped ensure that school security remained effective while also building positive relationships between police and school employees. Custodial staff had expressed appreciation for the regular police presence, noting that they felt safer knowing that officers were monitoring the building during their work hours. The positive relationship had also created opportunities for information sharing that enhanced security for the entire school community. As the night shift moved toward its midpoint, Sergeant Rodriguez reflected on how the overnight hours allowed for a different type of police work that emphasized relationship building, problem prevention, and thoughtful attention to community needs. The reduced call volume created opportunities for the kind of proactive engagement that strengthened community trust and prevented problems before they required emergency response. Station remained quiet except for the gentle hum of radio communications and the soft sounds of paperwork being processed. The overnight crew worked steadily through their responsibilities, maintaining the vigilant watch that allowed the community to sleep safely while knowing that dedicated officers were protecting their welfare through the vulnerable hours of darkness. Clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, marking time in a building where time moved differently than in the outside world, where each hour represented another period of safety maintained and another opportunity to serve the community's need for security and peace. In the gentle glow of dimmed lights, the night shift continued its patient work of keeping watch over a sleeping city. Evidence custodian Margaret Foster had spent 17 years maintaining the delicate ecosystem of the Central Evidence Repository, a climate-controlled facility in the basement of the Public Safety Building, where thousands of items waited in careful preservation for the remote possibility that they might someday be needed again. The repository occupied 3 interconnected rooms that had been specially designed to protect physical evidence from the natural processes of decay that claimed all material things given sufficient time. The largest room contained metal shelving, units that reached from floor to ceiling, each shelf holding plastic containers and manila envelopes that bore the careful labels required by chain of custody procedures. Every item had been photographed, cataloged, and assigned a unique identification number that connected it to case files maintained in other parts of the building. The systematic organization ensured that any piece of evidence could be located quickly, though most items had not been disturbed since their initial processing years or even decades earlier. Margaret began her morning routine by checking the environmental monitoring systems that maintained precise temperature and humidity levels necessary for long-term preservation. The oldest items in the collection dated back to the 1940s, and their continued existence required constant attention to the atmospheric conditions that could either preserve or destroy the physical materials that served as silent witnesses to long-resolved crimes. She moved slowly through the first room, conducting the visual inspection that allowed her to monitor the condition of containers and identify any items that might require special attention or conservation treatment. The evidence repository served as a kind of museum of human conflict, preserving not just the physical objects that had played roles in criminal cases, but also the careful documentation that explained their significance within the larger stories of which they had been small but crucial parts. The photography section occupied a corner of the main room, where thousands of black and white prints rested in acid-free envelopes that protected them from light exposure and chemical degradation. These photographs had been taken by police photographers who had understood that their work would create permanent records of crime scenes, evidence, and the people whose lives had intersected with law enforcement investigations. Margaret pulled one of the older envelopes, handling it with the careful touch that long experience had taught her was necessary for these fragile documents. The photographs inside had been taken in 1953 during the investigation of a burglary at Morrison's hardware store, documenting both the crime scene and the recovered evidence that had led to the perpetrator's identification and arrest. The first photograph showed the store's interior as it had been found by the responding officer, with merchandise scattered across the floor and the cash register drawer standing open. The image captured the chaos that crime created in spaces that had been organized for peaceful commercial activity, transforming a familiar neighborhood business into a scene that required careful documentation and analysis. Subsequent photographs showed individual pieces of evidence that had been collected during the investigation, including tool marks on the forced door, fingerprints that had been lifted from the cash register, and items of merchandise that had been abandoned by the fleeing burglar. Each photograph had been taken with meticulous attention to detail, using techniques that created clear images despite the limited photographic technology available in that era. The investigation had been conducted by Detective William Hayes, whose patient approach to evidence collection had created a comprehensive record that led to the identification of Tommy Sullivan, a 16-year-old local boy who had been struggling with family problems and had turned to theft as a way of obtaining money for basic necessities. The photographs documented not just the crime itself, but the methodical police work that had transformed physical evidence into a coherent understanding of what had occurred. Margaret had read the case file associated with these photographs, learning that Detective Hayes had approached Tommy's situation with unusual compassion for that era. Rather than simply processing the boy through the juvenile justice system, Detective Hayes had worked with Tommy's family and community organizations to address the underlying problems that had led to the burglary. Tommy had been living with an alcoholic father who was unable to maintain steady employment, leaving the family without adequate resources for basic necessities. The boy had been stealing to provide food and clothing for himself and his younger sister, viewing his criminal activity as necessary for their survival rather than as malicious behavior. The resolution documented in the case file had involved connecting Tommy's family with social services that could provide financial assistance and alcohol treatment for his father. Tommy had been required to make restitution for the stolen items, but the payment plan had been structured to allow him to work off the debt through employment at the hardware store, where Mr. Morrison had agreed to provide both supervision and legitimate income. The arrangement had been successful, with Tommy eventually becoming a trusted employee who worked at the hardware store throughout his high school years. The photographs that documented his crime had become artifacts of a story that illustrated how patient police work and community cooperation could transform potential tragedy into opportunity for positive growth and development. Margaret carefully returned the 1953 photographs to their protective envelope and pulled another collection from the 1960s that documented a more complex case involving a series of thefts from local churches. The photograph showed the crime scenes at 3 different religious institutions where someone had broken into collection boxes and stolen money that had been donated for various charitable purposes. The images captured the violated sanctity of spaces that had been designed for peaceful worship and community gathering. The photographer had documented not just the physical evidence of forced entry, but also the emotional impact of crimes that had violated the trust that religious communities depended upon for their spiritual and social functions. Detective Sarah Kim had investigated these cases with particular sensitivity to the religious and cultural dimensions of the crimes, recognizing that theft from churches represented more than simple property crime for the affected communities. Her investigation had revealed that the perpetrator was Maria Santos, a recently divorced mother of 3 who had been struggling to pay rent and buy food after her ex-husband had stopped providing child support. The photographs documented the investigation's progression from crime scene analysis to the recovery of evidence that led to Maria's identification. But the case file revealed that Detective Kim had approached Maria's situation with empathy rather than simple enforcement. Recognizing that her crimes had emerged from desperate circumstances rather than malicious intent, the resolution had involved the affected churches working together to provide assistance to Maria's family while also requiring her to make restitution for the stolen donations. The religious communities had viewed her situation as an opportunity to practice the charitable principles they preached, offering employment, childcare assistance, and emotional support that allowed Maria to stabilize her family situation. Maria had eventually become an active member of one of the churches where she had committed theft, serving as a volunteer in programs that helped other families facing financial crises. The photographs that documented her crimes had become part of a larger story about forgiveness, community support, and the possibility of redemption that could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. Margaret moved to the section where clothing and personal items were stored, noting how these physical objects carried emotional weight that transcended their simple material existence. A child's jacket that had been worn during a kidnapping, investigation, a wedding ring that had been recovered after a robbery, a military medal that had been stolen and later returned to its owner. Each item represented personal stories that had intersected with criminal activity and law enforcement. Response. She paused at a container that held evidence from a 1975 missing person case that had captured the community's attention for several months. The missing person had been Dorothy Chun, a college student who had disappeared while walking home from her part-time job at the local library. The evidence included the book she had been carrying, her purse with its contents carefully cataloged, and photographs of the location where these items had been found. The investigation had been conducted by Detective Robert Martinez, who had approached the case with the systematic patience that characterized the most effective missing person investigations. The photographs documented the search procedures that had eventually led to Dorothy's discovery in a remote wooded area, where she had taken shelter after becoming disoriented during a sudden illness that had affected her memory and judgment. Dorothy had been found alive but suffering from a medical condition that had not been previously diagnosed, causing periodic episodes of confusion that had led to her disappearance. The evidence that had been collected during the search had ultimately served not to solve a crime, but to reunite a young woman with her worried family and to identify a medical problem that required ongoing treatment. The photographs from this case showed the careful documentation of a search that had involved dozens of volunteers and multiple law enforcement agencies working together to locate a missing community member. The images captured both the methodical police work and the community cooperation that had made Dorothy's safe recovery possible. Margaret had learned that Dorothy had gone on to complete her college education and had become a social worker specializing in helping families navigate medical and social service systems. The evidence from her disappearance had been preserved even though no crime had been committed, serving as documentation of community response to crisis and the importance of thorough investigation in missing person cases. The weapons storage area occupied a separate room with enhanced security measures, where firearms, knives, and other implements that had been used in violent crimes waited in locked containers. These items carried the heaviest emotional weight in the evidence repository, representing moments when human conflicts had escalated beyond words to physical violence that had required legal intervention. Margaret entered this area with particular care, noting the solemn atmosphere that seemed to surround objects that had been instruments of harm. Each weapon had been thoroughly documented and analyzed, with photographs showing not just the items themselves but also the forensic evidence that connected them to specific crimes and perpetrators. One case that had left a lasting impression involved a domestic violence incident from 1978 where a kitchen knife had been used to threaten but not harm a family member during an argument that had escalated beyond normal family conflict. The investigation had been conducted by Officer Jennifer Walsh, who had approached the case with understanding of the complex dynamics that characterize domestic violence situations. The perpetrator had been Robert Kim, a factory worker who had been struggling with alcohol dependency and the stress of supporting his family on wages that were insufficient for their basic needs. The domestic violence incident had occurred during a period when Robert had been drinking heavily and had become increasingly volatile in his interactions with his wife and children. Officer Walsh had recognized that simply arresting Robert would not address the underlying problems that had led to the violent incident, and might actually make the family situation worse by removing their primary source of income. She had worked with the family and community organizations to develop a comprehensive response that addressed both Robert's alcohol problem and the economic pressures that were contributing to family stress. The resolution had involved Robert participating in alcohol treatment and anger management programs while also maintaining his employment and family relationships under careful supervision. The knife that had been used to threaten his family had been removed from their home, but Robert had been allowed to continue living with his family while demonstrating his commitment to addressing his behavioral problems. The intervention had been successful, with Robert maintaining sobriety and developing better strategies for managing stress and conflict within his family. Officer Walsh had maintained contact with the family for more than a year after the incident, ensuring that the treatment programs were effective and that no further violence occurred. The knife that had represented the potential for serious harm had been preserved in the evidence repository, but the story associated with it had become one of successful intervention and family healing rather than criminal punishment. The case had demonstrated how law enforcement could address domestic violence in ways that protected victims while also providing opportunities for perpetrators to address their problems and maintain their family relationships. Margaret continued her inspection of the weapons storage area, noting how each item represented not just criminal evidence but also human stories that had found resolution through patient police work and community support. The systematic preservation of these objects ensured that their stories would be remembered, even after the immediate participants had moved on with their lives. The document storage section contained thousands of papers that had served as evidence in various cases, from forged checks to threatening letters to business records that had been used in fraud investigations. These papers had been carefully preserved using archival techniques that protected them from deterioration, while maintaining their legibility for potential future reference. Margaret pulled a file that contained evidence from a 1982 fraud case involving an elderly woman who had been victimized by a confidence scheme that had cost her several $1,000s in savings. The documents included copies of fake investment certificates, handwritten letters that had been used to build trust with the victim, and bank records that showed how the money had been transferred from the victim's account to accounts controlled by the perpetrators. The investigation had been conducted by Detective Maria Santos, who had approached the case with particular sensitivity to the vulnerability of elderly victims and the sophisticated psychological manipulation that characterized confidence crimes. The documentary evidence had been crucial for understanding how the scheme had operated and for identifying the perpetrators, who had targeted multiple elderly victims throughout the region. The case had been resolved with the arrest and conviction of 3 individuals who had been operating the confidence scheme. But Detective Santos had recognized that simply punishing the perpetrators would not address the vulnerability that had made their crimes possible. She had worked with community organizations to develop education programs that helped elderly residents recognize and avoid confidence schemes. The victim, Mrs. Elizabeth Wong, had initially been embarrassed by her victimization and reluctant to cooperate with the investigation. But Detective Santos had helped her understand that her cooperation was essential for protecting other potential victims and that she bore no responsibility for the criminal behavior of the people who had targeted her. Mrs. Wong had eventually become an advocate for elderly crime prevention, speaking at community meetings about her experience and helping other seniors understand the tactics that confidence criminals used to exploit their victims. The documents that had served as evidence in her case had become educational tools that helped prevent similar crimes from occurring. Margaret carefully returned the fraud documents to their protective storage and moved to the final section of the evidence repository, where miscellaneous items waited in careful preservation. This area contained objects that defied easy categorization, but that had played important roles in various investigations. A child's toy that had provided a crucial clue in a missing person case. A piece of fabric that had connected a suspect to a crime scene. A photograph that had served as an alibi in a wrongful accusation case. Each item represented a moment when a seemingly ordinary object had become significant within the larger context of a criminal investigation. The careful preservation of these items reflected the understanding that justice sometimes depended on the smallest details, and that evidence custodians served as guardians of truth in its most fragile and vulnerable forms. Margaret completed her morning inspection and returned to her desk to update the environmental monitoring logs that documented the repository's continued compliance with preservation standards. The work required constant attention to detail, but she found deep satisfaction in maintaining the systems that protected these physical remnants of human stories that had found resolution through patient police work and community support. The evidence repository served as more than just a storage facility. It was a kind of museum of human complexity that preserved not just the physical evidence of crimes, but also the documentation of how communities had responded to conflicts and crises with wisdom, compassion, and commitment to justice. Each preserved item represented a small victory of order over chaos, of understanding over confusion, of healing over harm. In the amber light of the evidence rooms, thousands of objects rested in their careful preservation, their stories sleeping peacefully in the ordered silence of institutional memory. The photographs lay waiting in their manila envelopes, their black and white memories holding fast to moments that had been crucial for their time, but had now settled into the gentle rhythm of historical documentation. Margaret understood that her work as evidence custodian was really about preserving hope, the hope that physical evidence could reveal truth, that patient investigation could bring understanding, and that even the most difficult human conflicts could find resolution through the careful application of legal procedures guided by wisdom and compassion. In the quiet sanctuary of the evidence repository, these hopes rested safely in climate-controlled peace, waiting for the next time they might be needed to serve the cause of justice and community healing. Detective Captain Helen Morrison had spent 34 years walking the streets of the city, watching neighborhoods evolve and change, while maintaining her connection to the deeper history that lay beneath the surface of contemporary urban life. Her morning walk through the downtown district served both as exercise and as a form of meditation, allowing her to observe how the physical landscape preserved memories of cases and conflicts that had shaped the community's development over decades of gradual transformation. The route she followed each morning began at the old courthouse on Fifth Avenue, a building that had witnessed thousands of legal proceedings, but that now served primarily as administrative offices since the new judicial complex had been constructed in the suburbs. The courthouse steps, worn smooth by generations of citizens seeking justice, still bore the subtle indentations created by countless feet carrying hopes and fears up toward the heavy wooden doors that had opened onto resolution or disappointment. Detective Morrison paused at the corner of 5th and Main, where a small memorial plaque marked the location where Officer Daniel Chun had been killed in the line of duty during a robbery attempt in 1987. The plaque was modest and easily overlooked by casual passers-by, but it represented a moment when the community had confronted the reality that police work carried risks that extended beyond the routine service calls that comprised most law enforcement activity. Officer Chen had been responding to a silent alarm at Peterson's jewelry store when he had interrupted two armed men who were attempting to break into the store's safe. The confrontation had escalated rapidly, resulting in gunfire that had left Officer Chun mortally wounded and one of the perpetrators dead. The second perpetrator had been captured several blocks away after a pursuit that had involved multiple law enforcement agencies. The case had been investigated by Detective Morrison herself. During her earlier years as a homicide investigator, she remembered the scene's chaos, the community's shock, and the complex emotions that had surrounded the prosecution of the surviving perpetrator. The case had forced the community to confront questions about justice, punishment, and the price of public safety that had no easy answers. The perpetrator, Marcus Williams, had been a 19-year-old with a history of minor crimes who had been struggling with drug addiction and unemployment. His participation in the robbery had been motivated by desperation rather than malice. But the death of Officer Chun had transformed what might have been a simple property crime into a tragedy that affected the entire community. The trial had been difficult for everyone involved, with Officer Chun's family seeking justice for their loss, while also recognizing that Marcus Williams was himself a victim of circumstances that had led him toward criminal behavior. Detective Morrison had testified about the evidence, but she had also observed how the legal proceedings had become a form of community grieving that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Marcus Williams had been convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, but the case had prompted broader discussions about crime prevention, drug treatment, and the social conditions that led young people toward criminal behavior. Officer Chun's death had catalyzed community efforts to address these underlying issues, transforming personal tragedy into motivation for positive social change. Detective Morrison continued her walk down Main Street, noting how the commercial district had evolved since her early years on the police force. Many of the small businesses that had been family-owned for generations had been replaced by chain stores and restaurants. But some of the older buildings still carried traces of the cases that had unfolded within their walls. She paused in front of what had once been Morrison's hardware store, where she had investigated her first burglary case as a young detective in 1975. The building now housed a coffee shop, but Detective Morrison could still visualize the crime scene as it had appeared that Tuesday morning when she had arrived to find the front door forced open and merchandise scattered across the floor. The case had been relatively simple to solve, with fingerprint evidence leading to the identification of Tommy Rodriguez, a 16-year-old who had been stealing tools that he could sell to support his family during a period of economic hardship. But the investigation had taught Detective Morrison important lessons about the social context of crime and the importance of understanding the circumstances that led people toward criminal behavior. Tommy's family had been struggling since his father had been injured in an industrial accident that left him unable to work. The family had been too proud to seek assistance from social services, and Tommy had begun stealing as a way of contributing to household expenses without his parents' knowledge of his criminal activity. Detective Morrison had worked with the family and the store owner to develop a resolution that addressed both the immediate crime and the underlying economic problems that had created the situation. Tommy had been required to make restitution for the stolen items, but the payment plan had been structured to allow him to work at the hardware store during after-school hours, providing both legitimate income and adult supervision. The arrangement had been successful, with Tommy eventually becoming a trusted employee who worked at the store throughout his high school years. He had gone on to attend trade school and had established his own successful business, occasionally stopping by the police station to thank Detective Morrison for the patient approach that had changed the trajectory of his life that the hardware store building now served as a reminder of how creative problem-solving could transform potential criminal careers into positive community contributions. Detective Morrison had carried the lessons learned from Tommy's case throughout her career, recognizing that effective police work often required looking beyond immediate law enforcement responses to address the underlying causes of criminal behavior. Walking toward the river, Detective Morrison passed the apartment building where she had investigated a complex domestic violence case in 1983 that had required multiple interventions over several months. The building had been renovated since then, but she remembered the layout of the second-floor apartment where the Peterson family had lived during a period of crisis that had tested the limits of traditional law enforcement approaches. Robert Peterson had been a veteran struggling with untreated combat trauma that had manifested in alcohol abuse and increasingly violent behavior toward his wife and two young children. The situation had come to police attention when neighbors had reported hearing loud arguments and what sounded like furniture being thrown. Detective Morrison's first response to the domestic violence call had followed standard procedures, separating the parties and gathering information about the immediate incident. But she had quickly recognized that the situation required more comprehensive intervention to address the underlying trauma that was driving Robert's violent behavior. Working with veterans, administration counselors, and family service agencies, Detective Morrison had helped develop a treatment plan that addressed Robert's combat trauma while also ensuring the safety of his family. The intervention had required careful coordination between multiple agencies and ongoing monitoring to ensure that the treatment was effective. The case had taken nearly a year to resolve completely, with Robert participating in both alcohol treatment and specialized counseling for veterans with combat-related trauma. Detective Morrison had maintained regular contact with the family throughout this period, providing both accountability and support as they worked to rebuild their relationships. The successful resolution had kept the family together while also addressing the root causes of the violent behavior. Robert had eventually become an advocate for other veterans struggling with similar issues, speaking at community meetings about the importance of seeking help for combat trauma and substance abuse problems. The apartment building served as a reminder of how patient, comprehensive approaches to domestic violence could achieve better outcomes than simple arrest and prosecution. Detective Morrison had applied the lessons learned from the Peterson case to dozens of similar situations throughout her career, developing expertise in coordinating services that address the complex causes of family violence. Continuing toward the waterfront, Detective Morrison passed the site where the old train station had stood until its demolition in the early 1990s. Station had been the location of a missing person case in 1981 that had captured community attention and had demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation in cases where initial appearances might be misleading. Eleanor Martinez, a 72-year-old retired teacher, had disappeared from the train station while apparently waiting for a train to visit her sister in another city. Initial investigation had suggested that she might have become confused and boarded the wrong train. But Detective Morrison's more thorough examination of the circumstances had revealed a more complex situation. Eleanor had been showing early signs of dementia that her family had not yet recognized, and her attempted trip had been prompted by confusion about dates and circumstances rather than a planned visit. She had become lost and disoriented at the station, eventually wandering into the surrounding neighborhood where she had taken shelter in an abandoned building. The search had involved multiple law enforcement agencies and hundreds of community volunteers who had systematically covered the area around the train station. Detective Morrison had coordinated these efforts while also investigating Eleanor's medical history and family circumstances to better understand her state of mind at the time of her disappearance. Eleanor had been found safe after 3 days, suffering from dehydration and exposure, but otherwise unharmed. The experience had prompted her family to seek medical evaluation that led to proper diagnosis and treatment of her dementia, along with support services that allowed her to remain safely in her own home with appropriate supervision. The train station site now housed a small park that included a memorial garden for senior citizens who had contributed to community life. Detective Morrison had attended the dedication ceremony, where Eleanor Martinez had been honored for her years of teaching and community service, transforming the site of her crisis into a celebration of her positive contributions to the community. The park served as a reminder of how missing person investigations required patience, thoroughness, and understanding of the medical and social factors that could lead to disappearances. Detective Morrison had applied these lessons to dozens of similar cases throughout her career, recognizing that successful outcomes often depended on looking beyond obvious explanations to understand the complex circumstances that shaped human behavior. Walking through the residential neighborhoods that surrounded the downtown area, Detective Morrison observed how the physical landscape preserved memories of community responses to crime and crisis. The community center on Elm Street had been built partly with funds raised after a series of youth-related incidents had prompted discussions about the need for positive activities that could engage young people in constructive pursuits. The incidents had occurred during the summer of 1988, when a group of teenagers had been involved in vandalism, petty theft, and other minor crimes that had created tension between young people and adult residents. Detective Morrison had recognized that traditional law enforcement responses would not address the underlying boredom and lack of opportunities that seemed to be motivating the criminal behavior. Working with community leaders, school officials, and youth service organizations, Detective Morrison had helped develop a comprehensive response that included both accountability for past behavior and new opportunities for positive engagement. The community center had provided space for supervised activities, job training programs, and mentoring relationships that connected young people with positive adult role models. The initiative had been successful in reducing youth crime while also strengthening relationships between different generations within the community. Many of the teenagers who had been involved in the original incidents had become leaders in the youth programs, using their experiences to help other young people avoid similar problems. Detective Morrison had maintained relationships with several of these individuals as they had progressed through high school, college, and early career development. Their success stories had demonstrated how communities could transform challenges into opportunities for positive growth and development. The community center continued to serve neighborhood youth, offering programs that reflected the lessons learned from the 1988 incidents about the importance of providing positive alternatives to criminal behavior. Detective Morrison occasionally visited the center to speak with young people about career opportunities in law enforcement and community service. As she walked through the tree-lined streets of the Riverside Residential District, Detective Morrison noted how the neighborhood had maintained its character despite the gradual changes that affected all urban areas over time. The houses still reflected the architectural styles of their original construction periods, creating a visual timeline of the community's development that paralleled her own memories of policing different eras. She paused in front of the house where she had investigated a burglary case in 1992 that had led to one of the most satisfying resolutions of her career. The victim had been Mrs. Dorothy Kim, an elderly widow whose house had been burglarized while she was visiting her daughter in another state. The thieves had taken jewelry, small electronics, and cash, but they had also destroyed family photographs and personal mementos that had much greater sentimental than monetary value. The investigation had eventually led to the identification of 3 teenagers who had been committing burglaries throughout the neighborhood to support drug habits that their families had not known about. But Detective Morrison had recognized that simply arresting the teenagers would not address the drug problems that had motivated their criminal behavior or the pain that their actions had caused Mrs. Kim, working with the teenagers' families, school counselors, and drug treatment specialists. Detective Morrison had developed a comprehensive response that addressed both the immediate crimes and the underlying substance abuse issues. The teenagers had been required to make restitution for the stolen items, but they had also participated in drug treatment programs and community service that helped them understand the impact of their behavior on victims like Mrs. Kim. Most significantly, Detective Morrison had arranged for the teenagers to meet with Mrs. Kim and hear directly about how the burglary had affected her. The meeting had been emotional for everyone involved, but it had created opportunities for genuine understanding and forgiveness that had benefited both the victims and the perpetrators. Mrs. Kim had eventually become a mentor for one of the teenagers, helping him develop study skills and providing encouragement as he worked to complete high school despite his struggles with addiction. The relationship had continued for several years, demonstrating how restorative justice approaches could create positive connections between people who had been brought together by criminal circumstances. The house served as a reminder of how victim-offender mediation could achieve healing that traditional prosecution could not provide. Detective Morrison had facilitated several similar meetings throughout her career, recognizing that many crime victims were interested in understanding why they had been targeted and in participating in resolutions that addressed the underlying causes of criminal behavior. Continuing her walk through the neighborhood, Detective Morrison reflected on how her 34 years of police work had been preserved not just in case files and official records, but in the physical landscape of the community itself. Every building, every street corner, every small park held memories of investigations, interventions, and resolutions that had contributed to the community's ongoing development. The city had indeed become its own archivist, with landmarks and locations serving as repositories of institutional memory that connected past events to present circumstances. The neighborhood she patrolled had been shaped by the cases she had investigated, just as her approach to police work had been shaped by the lessons learned from engaging with the complex human situations that crime represented. Walking back toward the police station, Detective Morrison passed the bridge over Miller Creek where she had responded to a potential suicide attempt in 1995 that had led to a broader understanding of how mental health crises intersected with police work. The incident had involved a young man named David Chen who had been struggling with depression following his discharge from military service and his inability to find steady employment. David had been standing on the bridge railing when Detective Morrison had arrived, apparently preparing to jump into the creek below. Rather than immediately calling for backup or attempting to physically restrain him, Detective Morrison had engaged David in conversation about his military service and the challenges he was facing in civilian life. The conversation had lasted more than 2 hours, with Detective Morrison gradually building trust and understanding about David's situation while also providing emotional support that helped him step back from the crisis that had brought him to the bridge. The resolution had required patience and genuine human connection rather than traditional law enforcement techniques. David had been connected with Veterans Administration counselors who specialized in helping former military personnel transition to civilian life, along with job training programs that provided both skills development and steady income. Detective Morrison had maintained contact with David throughout his recovery process, providing ongoing support and encouragement as he rebuilt his life. David had eventually become a counselor himself, working with other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. His success story had demonstrated how crisis intervention could transform moments of despair into opportunities for positive change and community service. The bridge continued to serve as a reminder of how mental health crises required patient, compassionate responses that addressed underlying causes rather than simply managing immediate symptoms. Detective Morrison had applied these lessons to dozens of similar situations throughout her career, developing expertise in crisis intervention that had saved many lives and prevented many tragedies. As Detective Morrison completed her morning walk and returned to the police station, she reflected on how the city's physical landscape had become a living archive of her career in law enforcement. The buildings, streets, and landmarks held memories of investigations, interventions, and relationships that had shaped both her professional development and the community's evolution over more than 3 decades. The cases she had worked were preserved not just in official files, but in the ongoing lives of the people she had helped, the neighborhoods she had served, and the community institutions that had been strengthened through collaborative responses to crime and crisis. The city itself had become the final repository of all these human stories, holding them in the patient memory of its streets and buildings where they continued to influence present circumstances through the invisible connections that linked past events to current realities. Every morning walk through these familiar streets served as a form of meditation on the accumulated wisdom of 34 years in police work, reminding Detective Morrison that effective law enforcement was ultimately about understanding and strengthening the human connections that made community life possible. The city's memory was also her memory, and both would continue to shape the community's future long after her retirement from active duty. In the quiet spaces between buildings, in the shadows cast by familiar lampposts, in the gentle rhythm of urban life continuing its daily patterns, the past and present converged in ways that only those who had served the community for decades could fully appreciate. The city had become its own archivist, and Detective Morrison had become part of the story it preserved in its patient. Enduring Memory. Records Administrator Elizabeth Santos had overseen the final processing and permanent archiving of police cases for 26 years. Serving as the guardian of institutional memory, who ensured that completed investigations found their proper rest in the climate-controlled peace of long-term storage. Her office occupied a quiet corner of the records division, where the steady work of case closure transformed the active urgency of ongoing investigations into the settled dignity of historical documentation. The morning ritual that had defined her career involved reviewing files that had reached their final administrative milestones, ensuring that all required documentation had been completed, all appeals had been exhausted, and all parties had received appropriate notification that their cases were being transferred from active status to permanent archival storage. This transition represented more than simple bureaucratic procedure. It marked the formal conclusion of stories that had once disrupted the peaceful order of community life but had now found resolution through the patient application of legal processes guided by wisdom and compassion. Elizabeth began her final day of work before retirement by opening the last batch of cases that would bear her administrative signature, a collection of files that represented the culmination of investigations spanning several years and involving the full spectrum of human complexity that police work encountered. Each file contained not just the official documentation of crimes and their resolution, but also the broader stories of how communities had responded to challenges with creativity, understanding, and commitment to both justice and healing. The first file concerned the Morrison family domestic violence case that had been resolved through a comprehensive intervention involving multiple community agencies. Robert Morrison had successfully completed alcohol treatment and anger management programs while maintaining his employment and family relationships, under careful supervision that had gradually transitioned from formal monitoring to informal community support. The final documentation showed that Robert had maintained sobriety for 3 years following his initial arrest and had become an advocate for other men struggling with alcohol dependency and family conflict. His wife Sarah had completed job training that allowed her to develop financial independence while also strengthening the family's economic security. Their 2 children had participated in counseling that helped them process their experience of family violence while also learning healthy conflict resolution skills. The case closure included letters from family members, treatment providers, and community partners documenting the sustained positive changes that had emerged from what had initially appeared to be a straightforward criminal matter. Robert's letter to the court expressed gratitude for the opportunity to address his problems while maintaining his family relationships, acknowledging that traditional prosecution might have destroyed rather than healed the relationships that had been damaged by his violent behavior. Sarah Morrison had written about the importance of the comprehensive approach that had addressed not just the immediate violence but also the underlying stress factors that had contributed to family conflict. The economic support, childcare assistance, and counseling services had provided her family with resources that strengthened their ability to weather future crises without resorting to violence or requiring police intervention. The community agencies involved in the case had submitted evaluation reports documenting how the collaborative approach had achieved better outcomes than any single intervention could have provided. The coordination between law enforcement, social services, healthcare providers, and community organizations had created a model for addressing domestic violence that other jurisdictions had begun to study and replicate. Elizabeth noted how this case exemplified the evolution of police work from simple law enforcement to community problem solving that addressed the root causes of criminal behavior. The file's progression from initial incident report to comprehensive intervention to successful case closure demonstrated how creative partnerships could transform potential tragedies into opportunities for positive community development. The second file involved the teenage graffiti artist Marcus Thompson, whose unauthorized street art had been channeled into a community mural project that had become a source of neighborhood pride and inspiration for other young people seeking constructive outlets for their creative energy. The project had expanded over 3 years to include dozens of young artists and had resulted in multiple murals throughout the city that celebrated community, history, and cultural diversity. Marcus had received a scholarship to attend art school, based partly on his work with the community mural project, and his success had inspired other young people to pursue artistic careers through legitimate channels rather than illegal expression. The community center that had provided wall space for the original mural had developed an ongoing youth arts program that served hundreds of young people annually. The case closure documentation included photographs of the completed murals, testimonials from participating young people and their families, and evaluation reports from community organizations that had supported the project. The local business association had submitted a letter documenting how the murals had enhanced the appearance of the commercial district and had contributed to increased foot traffic and economic development. Marcus had written his own letter for the case file, describing how the intervention had changed his understanding of the relationship between artistic expression and community responsibility. He had become a mentor for younger artists in the program, helping them develop technical skills while also teaching them about the importance of using their talents to contribute positively to community life. The mural project had attracted attention from urban planning experts and community development specialists who were interested in how public art could serve both crime prevention and neighborhood revitalization goals. The documentation in Marcus's file had been used to support grant applications that had funded similar programs in other cities, extending the impact of this single case far beyond its original boundaries. Elizabeth reflected on how this case demonstrated the potential for transforming youthful poor judgment into community assets through interventions that recognized and nurtured positive potential rather than simply punishing negative behavior. The progression from criminal vandalism to legitimate artistic career illustrated how effective police work could change individual life trajectories while also strengthening community institutions. The third file concerned the elderly shoplifting case involving Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, whose food theft had been addressed through a community support program that had connected her with appropriate social services while also preventing similar incidents involving other seniors facing food insecurity. The program had evolved into a comprehensive network of services for elderly residents that addressed not just immediate needs, but also the social isolation that made many seniors vulnerable to various forms of victimization. Mrs. Martinez had become a volunteer coordinator for the senior support program, using her own experience to help other elderly residents navigate complex social service systems and connect with community resources. Her transformation from crime perpetrator to community leader had inspired other program participants and had demonstrated the importance of addressing the underlying causes of criminal behavior rather than simply punishing its symptoms. The senior support program had served more than 200 elderly residents over the 3 years since Mrs. Martinez's case had initiated its development. The program had prevented numerous potential crimes while also improving the quality of life for seniors who had been struggling with economic hardship, social isolation, and health problems that made independent living difficult. The case closure documentation included evaluation reports from social service agencies, testimonials from program participants and their families, and statistical analysis showing significant reductions in elderly victimization rates in neighborhoods where the program operated. The local hospital had submitted data documenting improvements in health outcomes for seniors who participated in the program's nutrition and social support components. Mrs. Martinez had written a letter for her case file describing how the intervention had not only addressed her immediate food insecurity, but had also provided her with a sense of purpose and community connection that had been missing since her husband's death. Her volunteer work with the program had given her opportunities to use her life experience to help others while also maintaining her own dignity and independence. The senior support program had attracted funding from federal agencies interested in community-based approaches to elder care and crime prevention. The documentation from Mrs. Martinez's case had been included in research studies examining the effectiveness of restorative justice approaches for elderly offenders and had contributed to policy recommendations for other jurisdictions facing similar challenges. Elizabeth noted how this case illustrated the potential for individual crisis to catalyze broader community responses that addressed systemic problems affecting vulnerable populations. The transformation of Mrs. Martinez's shoplifting incident into a comprehensive senior support program demonstrated how effective police work could identify and address community needs that extended far beyond immediate law enforcement concerns. The fourth file involved the missing person case of college student Dorothy Chun, whose disappearance had prompted a community-wide search that had ultimately led to her safe recovery and to the diagnosis of a medical condition that required ongoing treatment. The case had also resulted in improved coordination between law enforcement agencies and medical professionals for handling missing person cases involving potential mental health or medical complications. Dorothy had completed her college education and had become a social worker specializing in helping families navigate complex medical and social service systems. Her own experience of becoming lost and confused due to an undiagnosed medical condition had given her unique insight into the challenges faced by people whose behavior might be misunderstood or misinterpreted by others. The search procedures developed during Dorothy's case had been adopted as standard protocol for missing person investigations throughout the region. The coordination between law enforcement, medical professionals, and community volunteers had created a model for comprehensive search operations that addressed both immediate safety concerns and underlying medical or psychiatric issues that might complicate missing person cases. The case closure documentation included medical reports documenting Dorothy's ongoing treatment and successful management of her condition, along with testimonials from families who had benefited from the improved missing person investigation procedures. The Regional Police Association had adopted the search protocols as training materials for officers responding to missing person cases. Dorothy had written a letter for her case file expressing gratitude for the thorough and compassionate approach that had led to her safe recovery. She had described how the experience had inspired her career choice and had taught her about the importance of understanding the medical and social factors that could affect human behavior in ways that might not be immediately apparent to law enforcement or family members. The missing person protocols developed from Dorothy's case had been used successfully in dozens of subsequent investigations, resulting in faster recovery times and better outcomes for missing individuals and their families. The documentation had contributed to research on the intersection of medical conditions and missing person cases, leading to improved training for law enforcement officers and better coordination with healthcare providers. Elizabeth reflected on how this case demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation and open-minded thinking in missing person cases that might initially appear straightforward, but actually involved complex medical or psychiatric factors. The transformation of Dorothy's crisis into improved procedures for helping other missing persons illustrated how individual cases could contribute to systematic improvements in law enforcement practices. The fifth file concerned the domestic burglary case involving teenager Kevin Morrison, whose thefts had been motivated by his family's economic hardship and had been resolved through a mentorship arrangement with elderly victim Mrs. Dorothy Kim that had benefited both parties while addressing the underlying financial pressures that had led to the criminal behavior. Kevin had completed high school with Mrs. Kim's encouragement and support, and had gone on to attend community college where he was studying business administration. His part-time work helping Mrs. Kim with household maintenance had evolved into a small landscaping business that served several elderly residents in the neighborhood, providing him with legitimate income while also meeting community needs for affordable home maintenance services. Mrs. Kim had found the mentoring relationship deeply rewarding, giving her opportunities to share her life experience while also receiving practical help with tasks that had become difficult for her to manage independently. The arrangement had provided both parties with intergenerational connections that had enriched their lives, while also preventing future criminal behavior. The case closure documentation included letters from both Kevin and Mrs. Kim describing how their relationship had evolved from victim and offender to surrogate grandmother and grandson. The neighborhood association had submitted a letter documenting how their positive example had inspired other residents to develop similar mentoring relationships with young people who needed adult guidance and support. Kevin's letter to the court described how Mrs. Kim's belief in his potential had helped him develop confidence and ambition that had been lacking when economic stress had driven him toward criminal behavior. He had committed to continuing their relationship even after completing his formal restitution requirements, recognizing that their friendship had become an important part of both their lives. Mrs. Kim had written about how helping Kevin had given her a sense of purpose and connection to the younger generation that had been missing since her husband's death and her children's relocation to other cities. The relationship had provided her with both practical assistance and emotional support that had improved her quality of life and her confidence in living independently. Asterisk, the mentoring model developed from Kevin and Mrs. Kim's case had been replicated with other juvenile offenders and elderly victims, creating a network of intergenerational relationships that served both crime prevention and community building goals. The documentation had been used to support funding for a formal mentoring program that had served dozens of young people and elderly. Residents. Elizabeth noted how this case exemplified the potential for restorative justice approaches to create positive relationships between victims and offenders that served broader community interests while addressing individual needs. The transformation of a burglary case into a sustained mentoring relationship demonstrated how creative problem-solving could achieve outcomes that benefited everyone involved. As Elizabeth reviewed these final cases, she reflected on how each file represented not just the resolution of individual criminal incidents, but also the preservation of lessons learned about effective approaches to community problem-solving. The documentation in these files would serve as institutional memory that could guide future officers and community partners in addressing similar challenges with wisdom gained through experience. The permanent archival storage where these files would rest represented more than simple record keeping. It constituted a repository of community wisdom about how human conflicts could be addressed through patience, creativity, and commitment to both justice and healing. Each case had contributed to the collective understanding of how law enforcement could serve broader community development goals while maintaining public safety and individual accountability. Elizabeth opened the final file of her career, a comprehensive report documenting the community policing program that had emerged from the collective lessons learned through cases like those she had just reviewed. The program had evolved over 15 years from individual creative interventions to a systematic approach that integrated law enforcement with social services, community organizations, healthcare providers, and educational institutions. The program evaluation showed significant reductions in recidivism rates, increased community satisfaction with police services, and improved outcomes for both crime victims and offenders. The collaborative approach had attracted attention from researchers and policymakers who were interested in models for community-based crime prevention and intervention. The documentation included testimonials from hundreds of community members whose lives had been touched by the program's interventions, along with statistical analysis showing measurable improvements in neighborhood safety, family stability, and youth development outcomes. The economic analysis demonstrated that the program's comprehensive approach was more cost-effective than traditional prosecution and incarceration for many types of criminal behavior. Elizabeth wrote her final administrative notation in the margins of the community policing evaluation, certifying that all required documentation had been completed and that the file was ready for permanent archival storage. This notation represented the culmination of her career in records administration and the formal closure of a chapter in the community's ongoing story of learning how to address human conflicts with wisdom and compassion. As she prepared to transfer her final batch of completed cases to the archival storage facility, Elizabeth reflected on the evolution she had witnessed over her 26 years of case closure work. The early files had documented a more traditional approach to law enforcement that emphasized punishment and deterrence, while the more recent cases reflected a community policing philosophy that prioritized problem-solving and relationship building. The transformation had not been sudden or dramatic, but had emerged gradually through the accumulated wisdom of officers, community partners, and citizens who had learned that effective crime prevention required addressing the underlying social conditions that created opportunities for criminal behavior. Each case had contributed to this learning process, building institutional knowledge that had improved outcomes for subsequent cases. The final transfer of completed cases to permanent storage felt like participating in a sacred ritual, ensuring that the lessons learned through years of patient work would be preserved for future generations who might face similar challenges. The archival facility would protect these documents from the natural processes of decay, while also making them available for research and reference that could guide future policy development. Elizabeth locked her office door for the final time and walked slowly through the records division, noting how the steady work of case processing continued around her as other administrators carried forward the mission of transforming active investigations into permanent institutional memory. The work would continue long after her retirement, preserving the ongoing story of how the community learned to address crime and conflict with increasing wisdom and effectiveness. In the climate-controlled silence of the archival storage facility, thousands of case files rested in perfect order, their stories complete, their lessons preserved, their conflicts resolved through the patient application of justice tempered by mercy. Each file represented a moment when the community had faced a challenge and had chosen to respond with creativity, understanding, and commitment to both accountability and healing. The final filing cabinet would soon hold Elizabeth's last cases, adding their stories to the vast collection of human experiences that documented the community's ongoing journey toward more effective approaches to maintaining safety while preserving dignity for all involved. In the ordered silence of completed cases, the endless cycle of human conflict and resolution had found its peaceful rest, waiting patiently to inform future generations about the possibility of justice that healed rather than simply punished. The last case folders lay in perfect silence, their stories complete, their lessons learned, their peace finally earned through the patient work of justice served and mercy given. In this final rest, they would continue to serve the community by preserving the wisdom gained through years of learning how to transform individual crises into opportunities for collective growth, understanding, and hope.